Family development. When we were last talking about the ecological perspective, the last point on that was that the fifth level of the ecosystem that's important is the chronosystem, right? So time. And so what factors into that is still another perspective on family, on family dynamics, and that's called the family development perspective. It's an outgrowth and part of the systems perspective, but it's one that incorporates time into it very explicitly. And in some ways, it's the only true family perspective, because it applies only to families. Because it identifies specific aspects of a family's change and development over time. Just like you might have an individual development theory that explains how individuals develop cognitively, emotionally, ethically, et cetera, morally, et cetera, you can think that maybe families develop too. That families are ongoing living systems, just like an individual is an ongoing living system. And so we might be able to anticipate events in its times over its life course, and how things that happen at one point in the life course impact things at a later part of the life course. And so the family development perspective has really developed that idea of the chronosystem in the ecological perspective as it applies to families. So I want to talk about general focus of this approach, basic assumptions and concepts, and then finish today with transition to marriage. And then when we come back to it, after this, we'll then look at the transition to parenthood in particular. So the general focus of family development is systematic and pattern changes experienced by families as they move through stages of their family life course. So this perspective tries to identify, or first assumes, that there are systematic and pattern changes that families go through. That we've all lived in families, we grew up in families, and to some degree, what happened in those families over our life course, we shared to some degree. Do you think that's plausible? That what your life was like when you were a young child was probably similar to what your life was like as a young child, and my life as a young child. Now, there were individual differences, but the basic parameters of growing up in that family were probably pretty similar, other things being equal. And so, why? Because, well, we were young children. And young children have certain things that have to be taken care of. Society puts pressures on our parents to treat us in particular ways. The family gets exposed to the exterior environment when we go to school, for example, and that demands certain changes in roles. And so all our parents had to adjust to that. And since they were adjusting to the same basic parameters of life that were established by the fact that we were now going to school, they all, there were some variations. Some did it better than others. Some developed slightly different strategies. But all in all, those families were being influenced in a fairly similar way. And so that's what we mean by systematic and pattern changes that happen in families as they grow and develop. So families start, couples get together, they find each other, they develop a relationship, they go steady or whatever, they get engaged, then they get married. Think it changes when they get married? Yeah, and you can always predict how it's going to change. And then they have a child. That's a whole new idea. So life is going to change again. Then that child gets older and goes to school. Goes to school, a whole new set of ideas, a whole new set of parameters. And so we can anticipate that things are going to move in a systematic way, that there'll be patterns that are shared by families to some degree, or at least challenges that are shared, and with only limited numbers of possible ways to truly meet those challenges. And so families will, as they go through their life course, and the children get to be adolescents and move into high school, new changes happen, and then they go off to college, and we call them launched. They become launched, and then they're all gone, and then the family's a little small unit again. Everybody's gone. What do we do now? And so you can see that at different points in time, we're going to see family life evolve in a systematic and patterned way. Not only that, but what happens at an earlier point in time when we try to adapt to the new those new challenges, some families might not do as good a job. And you can imagine that if they didn't do a good job when they made the transition to marriage, do you think it'll be as easy for them to make the transition to parenthood? That there might be things they need to do at these different points in time in order to make sure that in the future they have a smoother transition and they're more successful transition. And so that's the idea behind the family development perspective. There are three sources of patterning in family life that it points to. The first is individual maturation and change. So families consist of members who themselves are changing in predictable ways. Those changes, cognitive and physical, for sure. You know, young children, they go through Piaget's cognitive stages. They go through stages of language development, moral development, it's identity development, etc. And those cognitive changes are, to some degree, built in to the individual organism. We call them ontological changes. They come from within. No one's necessarily changing the individual, making that way. There's something unfolding from within. Their cognitions, their connections are being made, pathways are being formed in the brain that then facilitate the ability, through their experiences, they then develop higher level orders of cognition, for example. Families have to react to that. And children, although it's not fixed by age, it takes a bit of time for these processes to unfold, and that time process is fairly similar from one individual to the next, unless there's some other kind of issue involved, some genetic deficiency in some way that leads them to not be able to develop as soundly as most. But most children develop according to a fairly similar pattern. That's why we are able to establish grade levels, and we kind of know what children are able to handle in terms of learning at different points in their individual cognitive development. We also for certainly know physiologically they change, right? Children can't walk, they can't crawl at all when they're first born, they can't feed themselves. So obviously that's a big demand based upon the caregivers. You know, and then they learn to crawl a little bit, and then they learn to walk, and once they learn to walk, like it's all over, right? I used to try to push my daughter down so she couldn't walk. I knew I was in trouble as soon as she started to walk, never mind talk. Right? So this physical changes in adolescence. People grow tremendously in adolescence, and they become sexual beings, and all of that complicates the dynamics of relationships and families. Also, social and economic changes. Oh, actually, I shouldn't say just the children develop, but the adults develop as well. Right? You get a little bit older, you get a lot older, you start kind of losing your short-term memory a bit. People get set in their ways over time. These kinds of people get sick, or their physical capacities go down, they have less energy as they get older. We also have social and economic changes, which are going to be very important. So people go to school, change schools, they go to college. For the adults in the family, they get a job, they start their careers, and as their careers unfold, the levels of demand in those careers tends to grow depending upon the type of career. So that's a social change that adults in families, in the same society at least, and certainly in the same socioeconomic area of a society, tend to experience in kind of similar ways. Excuse me. And then economics, right? You start off poor. Most people start off kind of poor. They start off struggling financially, keeping that job. They work hard. They don't get paid as much, but as they get experience in the workplace, they start getting paid more. And so they start developing their economic capacity over time. And so and these are mostly for the adults in the family. So a family with adults who are in their late 40s, early 50s, they're usually at a peak economic capacity time. So that makes things more possible in their family lives. And then they retire. And then when they retire, all that goes away for a lot of families, and they wind up having to cut back, and they can't do the things they used to do. So the kinds of capacities that they have as a family shrink as they get older. Originally, this perspective talked about the family life cycle. It was the idea that families are born, develop, and die. Just like the human is born, develops, and dies. Over time, and it was kind of in a fixed way. Over time, the perspective has shifted. We no longer talk about the life cycle as a fixed pattern of, larvae and adolescent, et cetera. Excuse me. We now talk about a life course. And we open the idea that that the course of family life, while it might be patterned, there might be several patterns. There might be the pattern, for example, in today's families of marriage, childhood, divorce, remarriage, child goes to school, child becomes an adolescent, et cetera, right? And so now we have to think about the different trajectories in the different life courses of families. But it doesn't mean that the perspective doesn't work. It just means that we no longer think of it as a fixed cycle that all families go through. We now think there are a group of life courses that families go through. And there's some regularity that happens with those life course trajectories. And part of it, that regularity, is individual maturation and change. As individuals' members change, that changes the demands and challenges that those families have to deal with, and that then results in a change in family organization and structure. A second is changes in family composition. So this is the simple addition and subtraction of members. Family member, regardless of who they grow, you get another child, or you get the first child, you've gone from 2 to 3, right? And then once the last child leaves, you go from 3 to 2. And those are profound shifts in family structure. And some families go through even more shifts in this regard. They get a second child, a third child, a fourth child, et cetera. And then internal developmental processes. This refers to really something that's the least developed in this perspective, and that's the idea that families consist of relationships. And a relationship actually has a life course to it by itself. That there are time-dependent patterns that happen in a relationship, even if that relationship existed in a vacuum. So, for example, we know that marriage satisfaction shifts over time, regardless of anything else that happens. We can almost predict that it'll be a shallow U-curve, that the satisfaction will gradually go down. It won't go down a lot, but you start off at a peak, and you can't sustain that peak. That's how relationships start, at a peak. But they're not sustainable at that. Once you get a high level of interdependence, people come into conflict with each other, and gradually they're not getting satisfied to the extent that they expect themselves to be, and they start to lose some satisfaction. And then we're not sure about what happens at the end. Some people say it goes up a little bit. Some people kind of says it's just sort of a shallow, straight line downward. Okay? But that would be a relationship maturation process. It's just a product of, if you never had any children, if nothing changed in your economic life, if you didn't change physiologically or cognitively in any way during your marriage, a marriage will gradually lose satisfaction. Why? Because it will gain interdependence. And as it gains interdependence, there'll be more conflicts of interest. As it gets more conflicts of interest, people have to work things out. Yeah, they might do it favorably, but it would be a lot better if they never had any conflicts, right? We'll just always be happy. We'll just always maximize each other's outcomes in life. It's not going to happen. And so that would be an internal developmental process. Relationships mature in particular ways. This perspective sees families as semi-closed systems. So again, using systems terminology, it tends to see that families, once they experience a change because of a change in a family member or a change in social circumstances associated with time, once they experience some challenge and make a change to adapt, they will tend to try to preserve that pattern into the future until they're pushed into another change. And so we say it's semi-closed, and remember that term, homeostatic. homeostasis. It's they go to a level, they experience something happens, and they shift levels, just like in the family stress model, right? The roller coaster of family stress, except not that severely because these are normative changes. All the other families are going through them at the same time, and they're not really severe challenges that, that can't be adapted to by most families. So it's a minor disruption of the system, and they have to find a new pattern of relationships in order to handle the new challenge that they're confronting. So families are semi-closed systems. They're influenced and shaped by processes at multiple levels of analysis, as you probably have already kind of inferred. Part of it has to do with the individual changes, the individual psychological level, and this is the developmental needs and demands of the family members. And so some of what happens in family life and the changes that happen over time are because they're coming from within. They're coming from things that are happening to the individuals. Some are at the interactional relationship level. And so, yeah, there's the developmental needs, but then families negotiate how to handle those things. And those negotiations then shape what happens in the family life. And this is a place where there could be lots of creativity, that some families might negotiate the demands in different ways. And that makes different individual differences from family to family. Organizational, and this is changing survival demands on family structure. So a family, as it develops, part of it is coming from outside as well. What does the society need this family to be like? And so the society puts expectations on families. For example, when a child goes to school for the first time, the question is, what kind of school system is that child embedded in? So K through 6 or junior high school is that kind of system, or K through 8 system. Those things are going to change the nature of family life for families that have children in those different kinds of school systems, because those different kinds of school systems are interacting with the family and putting organizational demands on the family to change in particular ways. And then finally, what we call institutional level, and this is social norms regulating behaviors and timing. So we live in a society, we have norms about what your family should look like when you have young children, what kinds of things you should be doing. For example, some of the norms in traditional society is if a woman worked, she dropped out of the workplace. To some degree, that norm is still there a little bit, right? And so society expects you to change in a particular way at a particular point in time because you have young children in your family. And so those institutional norms, they can change outside the family. So over time, we've seen those institutional norms change. We've seen women now not thinking that they have to drop out of the workforce when they have children. So not as many do. And so now we see a shift in the family life course conditions. And so we're going to see changes in how families are organized because the norms have changed in the larger society, right? The same true for a father. How much is he going to be involved in work versus how much is he going to be involved in childcare? We're starting, although much less so, to see sort of expectations that when you have a child, you should be there. You should take time off from work, right? Even professional baseball players, football players, they'll miss a game or two, even an important one, because they have to be there for their child, and people accept that. And so that's a very simple one, but then, and you should be around to take that child to places and care for that child and participate in its care. And so fathers are finding that their parts, their roles that they have in families, in modern society, a family with young children, the nature of how that demands of that young child, how those demands are going to change the family life, are somewhat shaped by the fact that in a modern society we don't have the norms of a traditional society anymore. We don't have such strict gender allocations. Some, but not as strict. And so a society at a given historical point of time, at the same stage of development, will look different than a family at the same stage of development in a different historical time. Or what does a family look like with a child with young children in Japan versus the United States? So cross-culturally, you're going to find variations in the patterns of family life based upon what cultural context you live in. Now, Japan versus the United States, a lot of it is both institutional, the norms, and the organizational. Because the school system in Japan is different than the school system in the United States. And so that's an organizational influence that alters the nature of the life course for families in Japan and makes them somewhat different than what families look like over their life course in the United States. So this perspective tries to incorporate all of that together. So you can see some of the system ideas in here. You can also see some of the ecological perspective in here, right? So this is the organizational and institutional elements, the macro and the exosystem going on here. Families are goal-oriented groups. They're trying to achieve some goals. And in the pursuit of the goals, they have different tasks that have to be worked on. And the perspective makes a distinction between two different kinds of developmental tasks. One is what we call the individual developmental task. This isn't what the family's working on, but it's an important concept for understanding what the family's going to have to work on, because individuals are working on something. So you think that you're a young child growing up, you're working on something, aren't you? Like, how do you learn language? Do children work on learning language? And how do we know they work on it?
Practicing it?
Yeah. How do they practice it?
Like doing it?
Yeah. What do they start with before they know any words?
Sounds.
Sounds, right? They just shoot these sounds out. And what they're doing is they're working on it. How do I get that language thing? And they're looking for responses to help them then develop it, right? And so children oftentimes, if you think of a child as a developing organism, it's constantly putting things out there into its environment to try to make sense of itself and try to develop its skills. Now, it doesn't do it consciously. It's largely probably genetically embedded in us, but it's doing it nonetheless. And as it does it, it's going to have to get certain kinds of responses if it's going to be successful. A child that keeps on sending those sounds out there and doesn't get any reaction never learns language, right? And so a goal or demand that governs individual behavior at a certain point of development as a function of ontological processes, things from inside, age or positional norms. Child's trying to figure out, oh, now I'm 5. What does being 5 mean? What does society tells me it means to be 5? Or family stage demands. The family wants me to do something more. And so I'm going to have to develop some skill to do it, to handle that. I'm going to meet the demands of being made of me by my parents or others. Or I'm an adult, I'm trying to meet the demands that my child is making of me. So for example, a parent who becomes an adult who becomes a parent for the first time, regardless of the demands of the child, has a big thing that they have to deal with. That's a result of being a parent, being in that family stage. They have to decide what it means to be a mother and what it means to be a father, right? That's a challenge because it means reshaping how they see themselves. It's an individual developmental demand. How am I going to handle myself? How am I going to integrate what I was before? How am I going to handle all those experiences that I had growing up that had anything to do with parenting and my views of parents, my views of myself? And I'm going to have to integrate that all. That's an individual developmental task that the parents are working on. So the infant's working on learning things and the parents working on developing their psychological well-being. And so that's an individual developmental task. And those are most important because they shape family developmental tasks. These are goals or demands that arise in a family system due to the need to accommodate individual developmental tasks or comply with societal norms. So the families have to deal with two things. At every stage, they're going to have to deal with what are the conditions or the demands or the tasks that the members are working on, and what is the society asking it to do? What are the demands that the society is placing on the family? Oh, you have to make a lot of money. You have to pursue these kinds of goals. You have to get your kid into college education. Society's telling you that, right? And so you have to manage those expectations at the same time. You have to give your kid more freedom because they're in high school now. Loosen up. Society's telling you that. And so the family has to reshape itself so it can meet those demands at the same time. So we, in the family development perspective, we have basically a triangle: individual, society, family. And individual and society factor into family developmental goals. Society and family tasks, and family and society figure into individual developmental tasks. Family processes are temporally structured. This is the most important one. And the perspective makes, with regard to this, what does it mean, temporally structured? Basically, it means that what happens at an earlier stage in the life course of a family is going to continue to have repercussions at the later stages. That's the most simple way of putting it. So we can make a distinction, and it's an important distinction to make in this perspective, between what we call chronological time and process time. Chronological time is simply how long were you in that stage, or how old are you as a family? What is the age of the family, or what is the age of the member, or what is the duration of time that the family has been together? You could think of that as its age, just like we think of the duration of time that you've been since birth. That's your age, right? So duration at the time of events versus developmental state at the time of events. So when we look at a family, we say, okay, well, how many years have passed between when the couple got married and when they had their first child? So we think of the timing of events. And what is the timing of things with regard to age or duration? And we could hypothesize that if it's a longer period of time versus a shorter, different outcomes would happen. That's a chronological time event. A process time event looks at time in terms of developmental state at the time of events. So it's not how long was it between when you got married and when you had the child. The question is, how developed was your relationship at the time you had the child? So did you do things prior to that that prepared you for having that child and being more successful when that child came along? And so that would be a process event. Age and duration at parenthood is important. How old are you when you had the child? How long were you married when you had the child? Were you married at all? That's an age duration effect. Maturation is of relationship at transition to parenthood is more about process time. It says, okay, you were married for 3 years, but what did you do in that marriage in those 3 years? Did you develop your relationship in a way that prepared you enough for that transition? And some couples can develop their relationship much more quickly than others, and so they might be older from a process point of view, even if they didn't spend as much time together than another couple. So events at previous, what's really critical here is that events at previous stages of development regulate processes of family development at later stages. So if you go back to, if I make an analogy back to the early stage theories of development, if we go back to Freudian theories, right? You've all heard of oral fixations, right? What's an oral fixation? Right, children put things in their mouths, and they don't learn, they don't satisfy that drive when they're young children. And so later in life, they continue to have that interfering with their development. And it can, from a Freudian perspective, these things were very important. You had to do adequate toilet training. And whatever happened at that toilet training could then carry forward, if it wasn't satisfactory, could carry forward and disrupt the rest of your life. Okay? And so it could shape your personality. Well, the same would be true here. It's saying, look, what happens at an earlier stage can really have serious repercussions for how you manage the next stage of your family's life, of course. Not maybe as fixed as Freudian theory. Freudian theory was pretty rigid in this idea. But certainly, there are things that a family can overcome, but it's just more difficult and puts those families at greater risk if they don't handle the tasks of an earlier stage adequately. So when you get married, you should have developed in a way, you should have handled all of those tasks, those individual developmental tasks that you had as an adolescent going into young adulthood. Should have done all those things that you were supposed to have done, because they're going to set you up to develop a good, solid relationship when you get married. And if you don't develop a good, solid relationship when you get married, if you have lots of conflict, if you haven't worked out your identity issues and your exchange relationships, then, and a child comes along before you've done that, then this child all of a sudden becomes embroiled into all the things that you're still working on from being married and never getting the adjustment to your partner. And so that's this idea of process time, and this idea that previous stage events have profound impacts on later stage events. Not that it dooms you, not that it sets you up in a fixed, deterministic way, but it makes the challenge more difficult. It adds additional burdens, which then puts you at greater risk. The risk can be overcome. Families have resilience. And so, nevertheless, you'd rather not have the challenge, right? And so this perspective is trying to tell families, look, we know, the research tells us, if you don't do these things first, then this is what happens or can happen later on. It raises the probabilities of these more negative outcomes. There are two types of norms that families exhibit that have to do with temporality, with timing. So it's not just that one event at early times predicts later events, but it's also the idea that time is shaped by society. And so there are individual age norms. So as we grow older, we have different expectations placed upon us for how we should act. Those are demands on us as individuals. There are individual development. They're contributing to our individual developmental task at that stage in our life. And that then puts demands on the family and thereby creates a family developmental task. But there's also norms about family stage and sequencing. So when should you have a child? What does society say about when you should have your first child?
Before the age of 35.
Before the age of 35. Okay. That's a pretty wide range. After any age?
Like socially acceptable?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say.
What's the normative pressure? Like, should you have a child when you're a teenager?
No. Yeah,
We actually have a social problem. It's called teenage pregnancy, right? Right? Teen mom. It's like, no, this isn't good, right? And for a long time, schools didn't let mothers go to school if they were pregnant.
Now they have actual programs.
Now they have programs, and they might keep them. I don't know if they keep them separate from the general population.
We had a program.
They're right in there, right? Yeah. Never used to be, because the norm was not to have a child, and so if you let them into a legitimate institution and participate, then that undermines the norm. Well, the norm's weakened more. But there's still a norm that we still call it a social problem. Right? Well, why? Why would a society have a norm about when you should have a child?
You're not mentally, fully developed all the way.
Oh, okay. So we're concerned about the well-being of children.
The responsibility factor,
Responsibilities, overburdens, the extra burden it would place on the mother's family of orientation, because they're going to have to take care of that child. The inability of a young, even if they got married, if the father married the mother, the inability of that young man to make a living satisfactory, to have a successful family. So society's looking out for its members, right? That's where partially that's somewhat where the norms come from. Also, the norms are coming from the political system. We don't want the burden of having to take care of you and your child. The idea is we have families, and that's where the dependency needs are met. Society doesn't take care of the children. Families take care of the children. So don't have one before you have a family. And you can't have a family until you can afford one. You can't afford one until you get an education. And so don't have your child. So these are very age-specific kinds of norms about when you should enter into the mother with child stage of family life, right? Enter into parenthood. So in our society, it's probably somewhere like, I guess if you finish high school and you don't go to college, then you can have one. If you go to college, you should wait. Why should you wait? Because, well, everybody knows that if you have a child before you finish college, there's a good chance you're going to drop out of college. And so that distracts from your norms. And so we give guidelines to people. We say, well, you can have a child if you're going to college. That's fine. Society won't look down on you. But we're letting you know that's probably not a good idea if you want to continue in your college career, because it's probably going to interfere with it. It's going to make it more difficult. The institution isn't set up to accommodate you, right? School isn't even set up to accommodate you working very much, right? Or even finding a relationship partner. So that would be, when can you experience a particular stage event? With regard to being a parent, probably somewhere between 21 and 35. Why not after 35? Health risks to the child. Maybe, you're getting older.
The factor that the parent won't be as active in the
Is this parent going to be as active in the child's life as a younger parent? Because they've got all these demands of career going on. Of course, they might have a lot of money too, so that could help. But, these demands, these sort of norms come out. They're not like a society sits down and says, well, we're going to set up these plans, but it's an outgrowth of the ways in which our society is structured, the institutions are structured in that society, ways in which we provide for the needs of the members as a society. And so the norms are there to try to direct us to fit in with the system. Because if we don't, then we experience negative consequences, or the system gets too much strain placed upon it. So these norms evolve over time as people care about people's families and people's individual lives. Also, there are things called sequencing norms. A sequencing norm isn't so much about when you should have something. It's about when, in terms of how old you are, it's more about when you should have something relative to when you've had something else. So think of the sequencing of a family's life. The biggest one is, when should you have a child? Let's go back to that. It's not only by a certain age, it's also, probably it's better to have it after you get married, right? You should get married first. First comes marriage. First comes love, then comes marriage, then comes baby, and then comes...
A baby in a baby carriage.
Baby in a baby carriage, right? Silly little nursery rhyme expressing a very profound, important norm in our society that would be way better for your family life if you got married and not only got married, but developed your marriage before you even decided to have a child or got pregnant. Getting pregnant and then deciding that you're going to get married before the child is born, that's a little bit better. It's not great, right? From this perspective, this would say, no, the sequencing norms are there for a reason. That we are trying to channel people into a process of family formation that is going to be optimizing their outcomes and optimizing outcomes for society. And so that's why these norms exist. And so getting married before you have a child is a pretty strong norm in our society. But it's only reflecting a small part of the reality, as we'll see later on. Because working out your marriage and your relationship under conditions in which you're going to live as a family for the rest of your lives together, however that long lasts, is going to be pretty important for helping you better able to adapt to the demands that that child's going to make on you. And if you haven't married yet, or if you get married like 3 months before the baby's born, well, now what are you doing? You're trying to handle dealing with the child's demands and dealing with your marriage demands at the same time, and probably is going to be much more difficult and less success, a greater probability of being less successful. And so that's the reasons for these norms are really reflecting something of a reality of life in families, that you need to take care of certain things before you can move to the next thing. And fit that in with what we were talking about earlier about the systems perspective. So we talked about a strong parental subsystem, right? Well, that gets developed in those early stages of marriage. It's pretty hard to develop it if there's a baby sleeping in a crib or in your bed, right? At the time that you're first getting married. That's a little bit more difficult, a lot more difficult. And certainly, you shouldn't have the child before you get married. Having the child and then developing a marriage? Where's the emphasis going to be, on the marriage or on providing for that child? The child's going to put a huge demand on family life. It's going to make it really difficult for that marriage to get going and to develop a strong relationship. And so these are these sequencing norms. Some things should come before others. Some basic concepts. The most fundamental is what we call the family life course stage. It's a specific point of qualitative change in family relationships. So, okay, so the family, couple gets married, go for a few years, they have children, the children grow and develop, they leave eventually, and then the couple retires, and one of them dies, and then the other one dies. Okay, I mean, apart from when that first child is, when they got married and when the first child was born, and maybe when they retire and one of them dies, what other points do we want to identify? Is it every year of that child? And what happens when the second child comes along? Is that a new stage? A child with a 4-year-old and a family with a 2-year-old? Do we need to make those kind of fine gradations of the family life course and think of it sort of as a continuous changing and developing process? Or go back to the idea that, remember, families are semi-closed systems, and they tend to try to create a structure that lasts over time. Are there some points where there are key points where there's a lot of stability in family life, and then that stability gets disrupted? And that's what happens in the family development perspective. It develops something called the family life course stage. And this is simply specific points in the family's life course in which there's a qualitative, a fundamental, major qualitative change in the relationships. Okay? And so there are 3 types of stage markers. Certainly, when there's a change in membership. Family grows or lose members. Those are going to be fundamental qualitative changes in relationships, because there's going to be a missing relationship, or there's going to be a new demand being made by a new child, right? Changes in individual development. Certainly when a child goes from early childhood, goes from infancy into early childhood, and goes to school for the first time, so preschool to school, and then, you know, once it's in first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, sixth grade, they kind of just happen. There's not a lot new. Small changes along the way, incremental. But then it all, whatever, shakes loose when that child becomes an adolescent, that physiological change and the change in school. Now all of a sudden you've got a whole new can of worms, right? You've got a whole new set of things to deal with. So that's a fundamental qualitative change. And so that's changes in individual development are going to be very important in marking family life course stage change, what is going to be a stage in the life course. And then changes in social roles. And so that would include the school, adolescent development would be individual, the school changing would be an important one. Also changes in social roles with respect to whether when you stop working as an adult, so when parents, when adults of the family, when they retire, that's going to provoke a significant shift in the nature of family life, right? So what's a big problem? What's going to be really significant when, let's say in the traditional family where the husband works, what's going to happen when he retires?
He's going to come home and disrupt whatever
He's going to come home and he's going to just like, yeah, he's going to disrupt the routine, right?
wife does, if
Yeah.
she stays at home or
Yep.
whatever.
All right. And they're going to have less money, and so the kinds of things that they could do financially, it might be less. On the other hand, they have a lot more time, and so there might be a lot of demand placed on each other to fulfill that time, to fill that time with something. You know, work always filled my life. Now all of a sudden I don't have work. What do I do? Okay, let's go back to marriage. You know, right? We haven't been in marriage for a long time. And so now it's a whole new ball game. And so that all has to be shifted. So major changes in social rules. The traditional stages that originally were developed in this perspective and still used today for research purposes. Early marriage, before children are present. Preschool child stage, before the child goes to school, after it's born. School-age child, when the child goes to school. Adolescence, launching, the period of time in which at least one child is gone and the other children are maybe still in the home. Empty nest, they're all gone. And retirement. Now, one thing that I should bring up here is that this perspective, when it sets these stages, it doesn't count every child. So what it uses is the oldest child. So when the oldest child is born, that's the first child, it enters into the preschool child stage. Okay? If a second child comes along before that oldest child goes to school, it's still in the preschool child stage. It shifts when that child the oldest child goes to school. And it stays in that stage until that oldest child goes into adolescence and into high school. Even though the second child might go from being preschool to school, that doesn't change the nature of the stage. Now, the assumption behind that is that families are semi-closed systems that tend to create a stable environment that doesn't change a lot unless necessary. So the oldest child is like the pioneer. The oldest child pushes the boundary. The family then makes an adjustment. And when it makes the adjustment, it works out new sets of role relationships for the care and nurturing of that first child. The second child comes along, doesn't have to rework out the role relationships, does it? It already knows kind of what it's going to do. It might tweak it a little bit. Oh, that didn't work with the first child, so we might try it a little bit different. But it doesn't make a major shift. It's not a major qualitative change in family life. And so this perspective says that's not a new stage. It doesn't enter a new stage until that oldest child moves into something new that causes the family to have to reorganize itself, to change the role expectations, to shift where it's spending its energy and its resources, right? To accommodate the new demands that come about because the child's in adolescence and attending a high school and needs that greater autonomy. So role relationships, levels of autonomy and cohesiveness have to change, right? Flexibility, rituals change. Now the second child becomes an adolescent. We already have the family structure in place. We don't need to change it again. And so that second child just funnels through, and the third child and the fourth child. Launching is when the oldest child is launched, is sent off to form their own life apart from the family. But there's still some kids hanging out. They're still there. They're still in high school or younger, right? And then empty nest is they've all gone through, and now there's none of them left anymore. Major shift, right? Major shift. Families have to say, oh, now what? We have all this time. We don't have all these demands that we used to have. So now we have to change how we operate on a day-to-day basis as a couple. We haven't been a couple for at least 18 years. What's that about? You know, we need to reshift, re-inspect ourselves and rethink about how we act towards each other and how we accomplish our tasks. Maybe even come up with some new goals for our family life. And then retirement, again, as we said, when one of the members or both, if they're both working, withdraw from the workplace, that's sort of the final stage in this process. Related to this is a very important concept called the family life course transition. So you can imagine if we've taken the family and we broke it into these stages, and we've done it because there are points in time in which the organization is being disrupted and has to be reorganized, that those points in time when a family goes from one stage into the next are going to be really critical, right? What happens at that point in time is really going to shape what happens going forward. So we call that the family life course transition, and that's where most of the research on family development focuses on. How do families experience these transitions? What facilitates successful transitions? What facilitates less successful transitions? And so a transition is a period of time in the family life course when existing structural and cultural conditions are renegotiated and subject to change. Points, what gets renegotiated? Main things that get renegotiated. What are our goals and identity? Who are we? What are we trying to accomplish? A marital couple, most of it's about us as a couple. It's about being with someone you love, that you trust, that you have a connection and a bond with. And that's the primary focus of activities. For most couples, there's a sense that maybe we'll have a child someday and that this becomes the prelude to that next point. But it's all about us as a couple to start with, solidifying who we are. Then when the child comes along, it shifts. It's no longer it's us as a couple. It's now, what are we as three? What are we going to focus now on? Are we going to focus on rewarding each other, or are we going to focus on making sure that the child's needs are met? And what does that mean for us as a couple if we have to shift that identity and those goals? And so that's a major point of negotiation, and some families do it better than others. Some families, the couple both are agreed upon, oh, now we have we have to look at our relationship differently. In other couples, one member is still thinking, oh, we're a couple, and the other one's thinking, no, the child is the major focus. And so that would not be a good resolution of this negotiation during that transition. Managing the household. How are we going to do our day-to-day tasks? Again, we come to transition to parenthood later on, but just as a prelude to that, and as an example here, how do we manage the household? So a child is born. We're both working. We both have careers. We've always shared household tasks. We shared in the cooking and the cleaning. Now we've got this child with all these other demands. We can't do that anymore. Are we both going to keep working? Or is one of us going to drop out? Which one? Or regardless of whether one drops out or not, how are we going to take care of the child? Are we going to share in caring for the child? That's a lot of demand. Does that mean we can still share in the housework? How are we going to negotiate those roles in our relationship? Because this child has disrupted everything. There's a reason that when couples experience a transition to parenthood, their marital satisfaction goes down. They're adjusting to these changes. Goes down less for the people who do it well. Defining internal and external boundaries. How much privacy do we need anymore? Can we have? External boundaries? Who's allowed in? Who's allowed out? Who's prevented from coming in? So grandparents are going to want to be involved in the transition to childhood, right? Transition to parenthood. Grandparents have an investment. They're going to interrupt life. How do you keep them out? How do you manage them successfully? That's a task associated with this negotiation element that comes about because this child is attracting others into the relationship. Or when you get married, how much do you still do with your friends independent of your spouse? You're married now. You don't go out with your buddies. I mean, or at least you restrict how much you go out with your buddies because the focus is on the marriage. Or I'll come back to that one later. There's a great movie about this I'll talk about later. Managing the emotional climate. How are we going to handle the conflicts that arise? How are we going to preserve our cohesiveness in this family? And that's all about the emotion. How are we going to preserve our bonds? Again, transition childhood puts a lot of stress on this. What's that emotional climate going to be like? It was all lovey-dovey before. Now, you're trying to find some way of having affection with your partner, and there's a screaming child in the next room or in your bed. How are you going to manage that? Should that child be in the bed? Given that this is an issue that's likely to arise in the transition to parenthood, maintaining the emotional climate. Maybe better to kind of find ways of controlling that in some way. And so this is about the life course transition and points of renegotiation, and this is where most of the research from this perspective looks at. It takes these stages and it says, what happens in these stages? What are the things that facilitates families successfully adapting? And what are the things that make it at greater risk? Let's look at a couple of transitions, and we'll see how many we get done. The first is a transition to marriage. And that's obviously the first one, in creating a family. Marriage is what creates a family. Today, we could say cohabitation, moving in together. In some ways, it's a start of a family, but it's by definition more ambiguous as a start of a family, because cohabitation is not a commitment to stay together with a person for very long. It has no implications for having children within it. So you're not really, you might be starting a family, but you're doing it in an ambiguous way. It only becomes signified either by having children and staying together after a child is born or getting married. And so we'll use marriage as the first point in the development of a family. And so when we make this transition to marriage, it has to happen in a certain time frame. It has to happen, it's going to be impacted, the transition, it's going to be impacted differently depending upon what other things have happened prior to that. That there might be some prerequisites that will make the transition to marriage easier and more successful. And so what are some of those prerequisites? And they have to do, to a large degree, with partner choice and the development of the relationship in the first place. And so there are three factors in how we choose partners. One, we choose it based upon an exchange process. We look for a balance of rewards and costs, and we develop an interdependency of our rewards and costs with another person. So when we develop a relationship, when we meet someone for the first time and start dating them or whatever, what we're doing is we're looking for somebody who rewards us, who increases our profits in life. That's the basic principle of social exchange. We're rational hedonists. We like positives and we don't like negatives. So we're not going to continue in a relationship with someone who's costly. We're going to look for someone who rewards us. And they're not going to stay with us unless they see us as rewarding them, as being profitable in their life. And then, so we develop sort of an exchange. Originally, it's pretty surface level. Take you out on date and pay, and we have good conversation, and that's sort of we say, oh, that was rewarding, so we'll do it again. So that would be, we find reward in each other. We find the person easy to be with. They're not demanding too much on us, so it's not very costly. And then as we continue to work with them, the relationship will develop further, and as it develops further, we basically start to focus what are the important rewards in our life as being more attached to that person than to our relationships with other people. And so we gradually create this interdependency of reward and cost outcomes. That we find that we need the other person and they need us to maximize our profits in life. That's when we start feeling this is a relationship that's going somewhere. There's a symbolic process in this, and that's you're not going to develop a relationship with anyone without communication and rapport, because with communication and rapport comes interdependence of identities. So we're looking for more than just rewards in our relationships, our intimate relationships that eventually become marriage. We're looking for more than someone who's going to reward us. We're looking for someone who's also going to enhance our sense of self, our self-concept. Someone who's going to fit with us in terms of how we see ourselves and how they see themselves. We're going to reinforce each other's identities in ways that fit together. And so we create strong identity bonds, which we call an interdependence of identities. And then, of course, we're doing this within the context of a larger social system, which is either pushing us together or pulling us apart, right? So we have lots of people around us, our friends, our families, our relatives, and they're pushing us towards this person, or sometimes they even decide who we're going to marry for us. This is the best person for you. I'm sorry, this is your choice. You don't have one, right? Other times it's more subtle, right? You like that guy? Isn't he kind of weird? You know? Did you notice that he doesn't comb his hair very well, or he smells a little, or whatever? Little comments like that, or sometimes even a little bit more interventionist. You're getting involved with a guy, he's definitely the wrong guy for you, we're moving. Or, hey, I think you're going to boarding school. Parents can do those kinds of things. But usually it's more subtle than that in our society. We live in a choice society, and so young people have a choice of who they want to marry. Parents tend to be very indirect in expressing their interests. Sometimes if they're direct, it backfires. They object. It just drives their young one to get married much sooner than they would have otherwise. And so there can be lots of outside pressures and barriers that come to play on the relationship. People competing with the love interest. They want this person to be part of their network, and they don't want that person, and they have conflicts with them. And so those triangles where they're unbalanced, so something called balance theory. It says that our relationships with all of our friends should be in a balanced way. So if I like somebody and if I like two different people and they don't like each other, that's a problem. That's an imbalance, right? If I don't like somebody and I like somebody else and they like the person I don't like, that's a problem, right? If I don't like somebody and I don't like somebody else and they like each other, that's fine. The world's fine, right? I'm not having a relationship with either of them. So we need to have a balance in our social relationships. And when we don't, that can put pressure on the relationship that we're in, especially if those other relationships outside of our romantic or future marriage relationship are important to us. And so, if we don't balance those out ahead of time, before we get married, probably they're going to continue to be something that is going to be a challenge for our family going forward. So at the exchange processes, individuals are motivated by profit maximization, and there's variation in the valuation of rewards and costs. People put different value on different things that they're looking for in a relationship, and so they value, some may value financial gifts or abilities or resources than others, and while others may value a good conversation, someone who treats you in a positive way. They can vary in terms of what do we think is an important value and cost. And what's going to be important is that whoever you find, if you find someone who's maximizing your things that you value, that you have to have the things that maximize the things that they value. And if that works out, then that relationship goes forward. Profit assessed relative to comparison level means that we don't expect to get the maximum from whoever our partner is. We compare what we're getting from that person relative to something we call a comparison level. What do we expect to get? How much should I get? And that how much should I get is based upon three things. What did I learn to expect from a relationship? So I was in other relationships prior to this. What was I getting there? Am I getting at least that much? I better be getting, or this one's not as good as those, so I'm going to pass it up. What did I get in the past from this person? So once I do say, well, this person is giving me more than I've gotten before from other people, and we continue in the relationship, I expect to continue to get that much. If all of a sudden it stops to drop off, then I'm no longer happy with the relationship. And what are other people getting in their relationships? I might be happy with this, but then I start seeing, oh, but that person's getting way more. And they're just like me. How come I can't get that much? Why isn't my partner giving me what their partner's giving them? And so that might decrease my satisfaction in my relationship. And so when the profit that I'm getting from my relationship exceeds the comparison level for the relationship, what I think I should get, based on these three things, then I'm satisfied and I continue the relationship, and it's likely to develop into a marriage. Okay? If for some reason I get married, because remember, social pressures and other things can play a role here. If for some reason I get married and I haven't developed this profit ratio to comparison level, then this is an issue that will always be in my relationship. Because humans are rational hedonists. We're motivated by profit maximization. And so I'm always going to be trying to get more. Right? So it's best to have that developed before I get into the marriage. Intimate relationships also require interdependency. Intimacy rewards depends on others' satisfactions. What this means is that ideally, before getting married, you should be at a point where you see giving your partner rewards as the source of how you get rewards. So if both your partner come to see each other as maximizing your profits in life, and if you shape what you think to be rewarding around the things that you do with your partner, then what's going to happen is you're going to do things for your partner without ever expecting them to do anything specific back for you. You're going to do things for your partner. Because in the end, it does come back to you. You know it does, because you've got this interdependency. And so the motivation that you have for your relationship isn't to get something. The motivation is to give something. It's fundamentally premised on the idea that in giving, you're getting. And that's essential because you're motivated by profit maximization. So you need to get to this point where you're not seeing your relationship as what we'd call a strict exchange relationship, where it's I give you something and you're obligated to give me something back. It's where I'm giving you something and you don't have to give me anything back. Because I know that if you're happy, then you give me all kinds of other things back. And so that's all I care about. And if that's the focus, then that's the way to enter into a marriage more successfully. Symbolic processes, development of intimacy requires rapport and communication. So at the heart of a marriage is intimacy. The ability to disclose what you're feeling, what's important to you in your life, what's important to you as a person in terms of your self-concept. You need to be able to explore those ideas with your partner. If you cannot do that, then you're not going to be able to meet the challenges that are going forward in your family life. Because at some point along the line, as a matter of fact, at every point along the line, there's going to have to be some discussion about who you are and who your partner is, and how, in negotiating how you're going to address some challenge in your family life, even something simple as who's going to do the housework and who's going to take care of the child, or who's going to keep working and who's going to drop out of the workforce, if anybody, that those things have to be discussed, negotiated within the context of an understanding of what are the important things to you that make you the person that you are from your point of view. If those work roles are essential to your identity, your partner needs to know that. Because they're going to become part of that negotiation. They're not going to challenge you and ask you to not do those, or to give up those roles. Or if they do ask you to give up the roles, they're going to have to make an understanding about how you might be a different person and help shape a new identity for you. That can't happen without disclosure, without intimate disclosure. And intimate disclosure is what we call intimacy. When people talk about their, and in particular what we call evaluative disclosure. When people talk about not what they did today or what their family life was or what were the events that happened in their family life growing up, but they actually talk about how they feel about what's happening today and how they feel about what happened when they were growing up, or how what those events shaped the kind of person that they saw themselves to be. That talk about those things that we don't talk about to just anybody, right? They're the things that we keep to ourselves because they make us vulnerable. That's intimacy. In fact, intimacy has been described as mutual vulnerability. It's mutual vulnerability because of mutual self-disclosure at this very evaluative level. So this self-disclosure requires rapport and trust. Rapport is the ease of communication. So when you talk to someone, you say, they're really easy to talk to, or I just find it so hard to talk to that person, right? Well, if you come away saying they're really easy to talk to, you've established rapport with them. How do you get rapport? It comes mostly from common experiences and values. You understand people without them disclosing anything to you to start with, because you've shared a lot of common experiences, and you have very similar values. And so we talk about hitting it off right away. What does that mean? It means you develop rapport. You develop rapport, you hit it off because you had common experiences and values. You understood each other without anybody having to disclose. And then trust develops as you gradually start to disclose, and the other person holds those disclosures confidential and responds to those disclosures in an affirming way. And so that then says, oh, I can trust this person because I told them something that was important to me and they didn't put me down. They didn't disclose it to somebody else. So am I going to disclose to them again? Yeah. If they put me down or they told someone else and made fun of me, I'm never going to tell them anything again, right? And so this idea of disclosure is this process that evolves and creates increasing trust. And as the trust develops and you get mutual affirmation, each person affirms what the other person is saying to them, this then creates self-disclosure, continues in deeper self-disclosure. And so then the relationship further develops. And that's what you need to have as you enter into marriage. You need to have developed that sense of trust before you get married. Because once you get married, you're in it. And so it becomes much more difficult to establish these processes under a condition of a structural constraint, which marriage is. Intimacy fosters then mutual reflective appraisals and identity interdependence. Gradually, with these disclosures, the other person becomes your source of what we call reflected appraisals. And I talked about that earlier when we talked about identity, remember? Reflected appraisals. How people's behaviors towards you either confirm or challenge your idea of who you are as a person. And you want that person that you're in marriage with to be the person that affirms. Their behaviors affirm you. And then you count on that person, increasingly, to be that primary source of reflected appraisals. Their opinions start to matter more than anybody else's, and vice versa. And so this is the emergence of a new significant other. So you're breaking off You're basically switching out who your primary significant others are. Grow up with your parents being that primary significant other or sibling or some members of your family, right? People that you have ongoing interactions with who have been very important in shaping your idea of who you are as a person. They continue to be important throughout your life. But with marriage, you're expected to shift that person to be the spouse. And so that process should happen. Otherwise, it disrupts the nature of what marriage is in your relationship. You're still looking to your parents as that primary source of reflected appraisal instead of looking to your partner. And in our modern society, marriages don't work unless it's the partner as opposed to the parent. The parent is secondary, the partner becomes primary. And that switchover is pretty important in terms of this transition into marriage in modern societies. Now, in other societies, not so much. Marriage was a different kind of institution. And so the affirmation of the self wasn't really the critical component. But in modern reflective societies, it is. And so that becomes part of the prerequisites for making a successful transition. Have you worked these things out in your relationship prior to getting married? Structural factors, social structure and cultural impacts the process. Who you marry is being shaped by norms of eligibility and desirability. And so you might be influenced by other people to marry someone who maybe isn't the perfect person for you because the norms say this is the person you should get married to. Location and social structure can limit or expand opportunities for interaction. So your availability, the availability for the maximum person for you might be limited by the fact that you don't have a good pool to select from. The marketplace might be particularly bad. And if you've got a bad marketplace, you're probably not going to make an optimal choice. So those marriages will be at greater risk. And timing pressures may distort the developmental process. So you're 40 and you're not married yet. You're an old maid, right? So what do? You get married. Well, was it the right person? Well, this is a structural factor that's maybe pushing you into a marriage that's not the right one. Family of orientation can impact the process, and there are three outcomes of, family of orientation can impact the process. As I said, families, your parents are going to try to influence you one way or another. More significantly, the family of orientation is important because of something that we call a differentiation in the system. So a family system can be more or less differentiated. What do we mean by differentiated? System differentiation with regard to family life is a condition in which the individuals have autonomy. Each person knows who they are and identifies uniquely apart from, part of their identity is tied to who they're in the family with, but also tied to others outside the family. And so the family that's differentiated gives members the opportunity to develop autonomous identities, but at the same time also has a sense amongst its members that they share a common fate and they share some common characteristics as a family. And so it has that cohesiveness with that autonomy combined into it. An overly differentiated family is one that has way too much autonomy in it. We would call it, Olson would call it disengaged. And an under-differentiated family is one that would be, Olson would call enmeshed. Right? Everybody's in each other's lives, there's no autonomy at all. And so if you come from a family that's undifferentiated, that lacks differentiation, there are three possibilities that can arise from this. One is over-involvement. I'm sorry. Stop for a second.
Got the boogie to it.
Mm-hmm.
It's got...
You should know it. Sorry. If you live in a family that we call a fused family, that's under-differentiated, There's not a lot of autonomy. So if your family is over-involved in your relationship, that can, in your life, then that can create a defensiveness in your own relationship. That you have this family that you're so tightly tied to that you then become defensive of that family in the relationship that you're developing. And that creates a tension in that marriage. Also, in undifferentiated families, rebellion can happen. So instead of embracing that fusion, that togetherness, sometimes the child rebels against that, and that rebellion can lead to negative selection criteria, and over-individuation. That the rebellion creates a sense of me first, that I need that autonomy, and I'm going to get it. And I'm never going to be in that kind of system again. And then when you get into a relationship, that's the kind of relationship that you shape in your family going forward. And it can also lead to you getting into a marriage before you've done anything else that needs to be done as pre-developmental tasks for that marriage. So you want to get away from your family so badly because it lacks differentiation, because there's this fusion, that you rebel, and the way you get away is to get married to somebody. So you hear this oftentimes with young women in particular, I got to get out of that. And so which way do I get out of it? I get married to somebody. Then I get them out of my life. I now have a new life, which isn't a good way to start a marriage. And then emotional cutoff can happen in these relationships as well. That the individual becomes suffocated in this enmeshed environment, and so they just sort of shut down their emotional life. They don't have autonomy, and so they deny any emotional feelings that would challenge them, given that they didn't have autonomy. They can't feel those things. And so they engage in what's called emotional cutoff. I don't care. And if you engage in emotional cutoff, that can create an overdependence on the partner. I don't care. You shape me. You make me what you want me to be. Which doesn't promote autonomy in the family going forward and tends to create an undifferentiated family system in the family of procreation. Also prerequisite to marriage are some developmental tasks of adolescence. So it's not just how you develop that relationship, but also how you develop yourself. And so two key elements. The first, in the development of adolescence have to develop a tolerance for individuality. They need to maintain independent self in relationship to have interdependency versus dependency. So the adolescent has to come to a sense that they can be an independent person, but also be in a relationship at the same time. If there's dependency, if they don't have that sense of individual autonomy in of a self separate from relationships, then there tends to be a greater potential for them being exploited in the relationship they wind up in, and also more control issues in those relationships. Also related to this is the need to tolerate others' individuality. There has to be a tolerance that the other person has freedom, that you can't suffocate the other person, that they have their own identity, and that you have to be able to deal with that. They might do things that aren't what you're about. There's differences there. And you have to be able to tolerate differences. You can't demand that the other person be just like you. And so, if there's dependency, it tends to create underfunctioning or overfunctioning. In this case, you either, if there isn't a tolerance for the other's individuality, you can do two things. You can force them to be like you, or the way you want them to be. Or you can say, if we're going to be different, then you just make me like you, and you give up your individuality itself. And tolerance for intimacy. Need to be willing to disclose and commit. And the big variable here is developing secure attachments. If you have a secure attachment style, then you have a greater tolerance for intimacy. People, when they enter into marriage, both have to have the sense that two aren't becoming one. the two are two, but that they are interdependent together. So there's a togetherness with the separateness. And that was what the ideal situation is for a family going forward. And that usually happens in adolescence. It's in adolescence that we get trapped into one or the other kind of condition where we don't tolerate individuality or we don't tolerate intimacy, one or the other. So we need to be able to develop both of these tolerances in adolescence in order to be able to successfully negotiate the transition into marriage. So the developmental tasks during this transition, family goals and identity, developing family themes. This includes establishing shared values, priorities, and goals. So the couple has to kind of, during this transition into marriage, they have to decide, what are we going to be? Where are we going forward? What are our dreams for the future? This really begins as early as forming, just making decisions about the wedding and the honeymoon, the rituals around that transition. Who's going to be invited? Says a lot about what you think about your family going forward. Are you going to have is there going to be lots of friends, or are there going to be lots of kin, or are there going to be just your immediate family? It's going to be a big wedding or small wedding. What do you value? Where are we going to go on a honeymoon? Are we going to go on a honeymoon? Is it important? What are the important elements of a honeymoon? Is it all about social class? Is it about vacation? What is the meaning of that honeymoon experience? Is it a place so that we can be together and have quiet and solitude? Or are we going to define ourselves as being sort of the happy, fun-going couple with lots of recreational activities? And so these are parts of what are our themes? Who are we as a couple? And making sure other people understand what it is that we are so that they can reinforce those things going forward. Are we a religious couple? So we're going to go to honeymoon. We're going to think about going on a honeymoon. Where are you going to go on your honeymoon? Well, you could go to, you go to Disneyland. Or you could go to a religious theme park in Tennessee. I think Gatlinburg has a big religious theme park. And so we're going to define ourselves within the context of our religion? Is that the most important thing, or is it something else? Develop a couple identity. This involves establishment of yourself as a couple in the network of others. So you're going to work on your trimming off your outside friendship networks, making sure that they understand that you're no longer just two separate people anymore. You're now a couple. Great example of this was a great movie years ago. It's called She's Getting Married or something like that. And it's all around the transition to marriage. They're having their wedding and they're planning their wedding. They've got to have blue potatoes because they have blue bridesmaids' dresses. And, it's a crazy story. But it's the night of their wedding night, and they're at the reception. And the guy's buddies who are at the wedding reception, they come over and say, hey, we're going out bowling. You want to go with us? He says, yeah, we're not leaving for the honeymoon for another couple hours. Sure. And he goes off bowling with his buddies. Not the kind of transitional event that you want to happen, right? What's it saying? You're not establishing yourself as a couple within the network. I mean, at least he could have said, well, I'm not going to go unless I'm going to bring my wife. We're married now. You have to recognize we're married now. You can't make the demands on me of an individual. That's an important message to get across to your network and to establish yourselves. Because if you have people coming in and making demands on you that are legitimate or that pull you apart from your partner, then that's not conducive to creating a common identity and a common relationship with your partner. And so and in doing that, you're also telling everybody around you that you're married now. So that factors into commitment. When you tell other people, no, I'm not me anymore, we're us, you're basically saying to other people, we're going to continue to be us. And so when things go bad, they're going to come back and you say, oh, no, you're a couple, work it out. They're not going to say, oh, yeah, well, I'm glad you got rid of her, let's go. That commitment that establishment of a couple identity in your network really establishes a kind of what we call structural commitment around your relationship. And then lastly, development of individual spousal identities. And so early in the marriage, it's important about this negotiation regarding conjugal roles and counter roles. I'll do these things and you can do those things, and we're going to work this out in a way that's mutually satisfactory. And it's not just working out an arrangement that's satisfactory at the time, it's also going through the negotiation process in a successful way, such that you optimize these outcomes and that you get used to negotiating those roles, because they're going to get negotiated again. You're going to have to talk about them again when a child comes along. And then later again when the child goes to school, et cetera. There's going to have to be some lines of communication that get established, some sense of what do you trade off. If I do this, you do that. Is that a balanced approach? You have to have those kinds of processes in place. And the first time it happens is in the transition to marriage. And so that's a really important task that needs to be done with regard to family goals and identity. We left off talking about sort of an overall framework for understanding what are the developmental tasks associated with this transition. And now I want to talk a little bit about a study that looked at one important aspect of this transition, and that has to do a lot with the kinds of preparations that couples have going into marriage and the ways in which they've developed their relationship prior to getting into marriage, and what the consequences of that would be for the success of their marriage going forward. And so the study is one called, it's got a cute little name, the Connubial Crucible, Newlywed Years as Predictors of Marital Delight, Distress, and Divorce. And it's by a group of researchers at the University of Texas at Austin. And we're going to see in a minute, it's based upon a very long-term study, longitudinal study of couples from before they got married, and follows them at this point, 13 years, up to 13 years later, and now today, they actually still are ongoing with the study and still following up the same couples 25 years later or more. What this model did was it tested 3 models of how premarital experiences affect the transition to marriage and later marital success. So, did you get yourself ready? And did that make a difference in the outcomes for your marriage? And then it adds into that, if it did make you ready for marriage, could something happen in those early years of marriage that then cause your marriage to decline? So a lot of it's focused on what happens leading up to the marriage, but then also some of it looks at, well, what happens in those first few years following the marriage. And the models that they tested, one's called the enduring dynamics model, the other is the emergent distress model, and the third is what they call the disillusionment model. And we'll talk about what each of these are in a minute. So, the enduring dynamics model. Basically, this model says it's based on what they say that it's based on personality match theory, although whether it's personality match or just how good a match did you make, whether it has to do with personality or anything else, I think is sufficient. This perspective, this model says that what you expect from marriage, whether you expect to be really super great and perfect or not, really doesn't make much difference. Okay? Your expectations going to marriage aren't going to make a difference. What's going to make the difference is your initial matching. How good a job did you do? Remember last time we talked about how, when we talked about the perspective, we talked about how an important element of that preparation or prerequisite for a successful marriage is that selection process. So did you select the right partner? Do you have a good thing going when you go into marriage? This perspective says that if you don't have a good thing going, if you didn't make a good match, then guess what? You're probably not going to be very successful. And so it argues that people get divorced in the first few years after marriage because they just didn't make a very good match. And they got married anyway. They chose poorly, as the knight in Raiders of the Lost Ark once said. right? You chose poorly. So premarital distress will predict postmarital distress, and that will be the biggest predictor. Now, you say, well, why would you get married to someone that you didn't really get along with very well? Think people do that very often?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah, right? You go to someone's marriage and go, oh, boy, this isn't going to last, right? It's very interesting. Women who experience physical abuse in their dating relationship with somebody, they marry them anyway. Because they think that what's going to happen is going to change afterwards, and it doesn't. It just keeps on going. People generally, once they establish a relationship, people change, yes. But once you get into a relationship, the dynamics of that relationship tend to take a dynamic and life of their own, and they tend to resist change. And so it's easier to change yourself than it is to change a relationship. Because changing a relationship means both people changing in relationship to each other, and that's more than twice as difficult, right? Because there are contingencies. I can't change unless you change in a particular way. So it doesn't matter if we both are going to change and get better. It's a matter of how we're going to change in ways that fit the other person. And that's a much more complex task than just changing the self. The second model is the emergent distress model. And this model says people make a reasonably good match. Other things being equal, this relationship would survive, but something happens along the way. And so this is based on more of a social learning, social exchange kind of theoretical framework that says, look, it's not a matter of how good you match, it's a matter of what happens in the dynamics going forward. So after you get married, does something go wrong that wasn't wrong to begin with? And so, again, it says initial expectations aren't very important. Doesn't matter what you expect to happen afterwards. What matters is what you expect to happen in your marriage. What's going to matter is what does happen in your marriage afterwards. And so it argues that greater interdependence that comes with marriage, because you're living together with this person, because your resources are tied to this person, because your outcomes in life are much more significantly tied to this person, because your family is tied to their family of orientation, and that complicates your world to a much greater degree. It leaves you less room to maneuver as an individual, a lot less autonomy. There's a lot more riding on the outcomes. And so this greater interdependence increases the likelihood that you're going to experience negative events that reduce your happiness and stability. That you're going to step on each other's toes and hurt each other. Some couples are going to do that more than others. Not because they weren't necessarily a good match for each other, but because they ran into difficulties that other couples don't run into. They had particular difficult families of origin that interfered too much. They had economic events that put stressors on their relationship, and they weren't able to recover because they were so great. Okay. And so these would be, this model says that things happen to couples after they get married. Some of it might just be that they can't manage living together. Maybe one or the other, or both, can't manage to live in that kind of commitment kind of relationship that's now different than it was before they were married in that regard. And so gradually they wind up becoming increasingly dissatisfied because things aren't working out. Or part of it could be that something significant happens that disrupts their normal pattern. And they would have been okay, but there was some traumatic event that interfered. And so that would be this emergent distress model. And it says that if that early marriage experience is negative, then you're less happy and less stable. You're more likely to divorce. If that early experience is more positive, then you're happier and you're going to continue on in your relationship and have stability. The third model is what they call the disillusionment model. And the disillusionment model is based more on they say based more on cognitive exchange theory, although again, they're using these theoretical frameworks, but I'm not sure that they're necessary. You could put this in a lot of other different kinds of frameworks as well. Symbolic interaction, for example, fits very well here. That it's all about your perceptions, the way you make sense and meaning out of your marriage. And what do you expect to get out of it? What do you expect it to be like? And that's going to make the big difference. And this relates back to a book that was written many years ago. Actually, it was a book that I've read for the first time in a course just like this when I was an undergraduate. It had just come out at the time by really a brilliant family psychologist named Crosby, who wrote this book called Illusionment and Disillusionment. It was all about how divorce really comes about because people become disillusioned. And they become disillusioned, they're more likely to become disillusioned if they had really high illusions to begin with. If they idealized their partner, if they believed that everything was perfect and that it was going to be an idyllic relationship, and they were never going to have any problems, they were never going to have fights about anything, it was all going to be lovey-dovey going into the future, that everything would work out perfectly. And so this illusion led them to not see the underlying flaws or difficulties that could be coming forward in their relationship. And then, after they get married, they continue with that illusion, and gradually the illusion wears off because the reality of who you're living with strikes home, and you're going, oh gosh, yeah, I never noticed that you didn't pick up after yourself and that you left hair in the sink or whatever, right? I overlooked that for the first few years of marriage. But ultimately, the aroma of the coffee starts to sink through, and you, oh, what did I marry? Who did I marry, right? This isn't what I thought I was getting. And bang, you suffer this immense disillusionment. And that leads you to really negatively evaluate your relationship in a way that, because it's so sudden, it results in breaking off the relationship. As opposed to if you didn't start from such a high point, if you kind of recognize the warts that your partner had and that your relationship had, and always recognize that, okay, you were good enough, but these were things that were always going to be there and you had to work with them and accommodate them, you're probably going to manage it. You might not manage at that ultimate high level that the illusioned couples operated at when they started, but you have a lot less distance to go down. And so you don't suffer this immense dissatisfaction. And so the illusionment model focuses on how couples idealize and form unrealistic expectations for their partners. And these usually come about from two important elements. One is something that is in our culture, and that's the idea of romantic love. And so a lot of illusionment comes from romanticization. That we believe that love at first sight, we believe that when you fall in love, this is the one and only person for you. There's a perfect match there. Yeah, this person is your ultimate soulmate, and that there is such a thing as a soulmate. And the idea that it might even be just one, right? And that when this happens, that means that this person is going to devote everything about themselves to you. And you're going to devote all of your energies and interest in them. And there won't be anything that breaks you apart. That you're just going to become one. It's going to be perfect. Huh?
Sounds horrible.
Well, but do you see that as part of our culture? Mm-hmm. There used to be a show called Ally McBeal. I don't know if you ever saw that show. I loved it because she always had to find the perfect man. And so she never found any man because she was always looking for Mr. Right, right? Bridget Jones' Diary. That's what it's about, finding Mr. Right. Oh, not missing the boat. There's only one person. If you don't get them when they show up, forget it. You're never going to find happiness ever again. And if you find them, you're going to have ultimate happiness for the rest of your life. That idea is not conducive to marriage. You might find your soulmate, but you understand that you're different. You understand that just because the person is your soulmate doesn't mean that you're always going to get along together. And so romanticized illusions in the culture really contribute to this disillusionment model because they create higher illusion. The other thing that does this is the ways in which we form relationships to begin with. And so one of the important elements in the early stages of a relationship is something called impression management. Right? We only show our good side. Again, you saw the movie Bridget Jones's Diary?
I don't think I've seen that one.
Never seen it? Really?
Mm-mm.
Oh, great movie. With, what's her name?
I know who you're talking about.
I can't remember her name now. And Hugh Grant and some other British guy.
Jude Law, was he?
No, not Jude Law. Well, anyway, it doesn't matter. But, you know, she gets the date with the boss, who she's going gaga over, who's absolutely the wrong guy, right? Because he's, what's his name? Hugh Grant, who always plays this creepy guy, right? And so he's coming over, so she's quickly stuffing underwear in her apartment underneath the cushion so he can't see it, right? Impression management, right? You've got to look your best. You hold back all the warts. You hide it. You put lots of makeup on, right? You brush your hair and comb your hair. It's like, what's going to be like the first night you wake up after sleeping with this person and there's no makeup on, right?
Don't look at me.
So we hide as much as we can those warts, not just the physical ones, but even more important, the psychological and emotional ones. We hold back. We avoid situations in which things might come out that would show us to be something less than our partner thinks we are. And our partner, if our partner is romanticizing the situation, isn't really going to look real hard to find the warts. Because first impressions make a difference. So if that person has this first impression of you, what we do is we're not scientists in our personal relationships. You know, what's a scientist do when someone makes a claim about what's true?
Does research.
They do research. And what's a fundamental principle behind the scientific method of doing research? If you want to show that something is true, do you try to prove that it's true? What do? You try to prove that it's false. Why? Well, because if you try to prove it's true, you're going to be blinded to the potential that it's not true. And so what you do is you stack the cards against yourself. You try to find why it's wrong, why it's not true. And if you can't prove that it's not true, then you have greater confidence that it is true, although you haven't proved it. That's a scientific method. Well, in our relationships, we don't do that at all. In our personal relationships, we do the exact opposite. We make an impression of somebody, which may or may not be an accurate one, because we see a person, they have physical characteristics, they act towards us through impression management to convey this beautiful image of what we want. And they kind of learn what we want early on, and they try to show that that's what they are. We form an impression, we say, oh, that person's not just these physical characteristics, but has all these other things that I haven't even observed yet. We attribute to that person lots of other kinds of traits that we really have no information about. Then as we get to know them, and as we interact further with them, we tend not to lose that first impression, even if it's wrong. Even if the person really isn't that way. Because we basically are putting on blinders. We're only looking for the things that we think are true. And we tend to not see the counter evidence because we're not looking for it. And so those kinds of processes result in people going into marriage many times with really incorrect perceptions of what their partner is like, or even what their relationship is like, what their dynamic is. So interdependence, as the relationship goes on and continues to go on, now it's going to take a while, but eventually the truth shines through. Eventually, you can't live in a fictional world your entire life. Eventually, the illusion starts to fall away. And so interdependence, having to be with this person all the time, undermines that person's ability to manage the impression and puts greater stake in your making more accurate assessments of your partner and your relationship, because now it's not just a dating or relationship, it's much more than that. It has a lot more significance. And so you gradually, that illusion, with greater interdependence with your partner, you start to come to the realization of what the world is, and then you suffer what's called disillusionment. And so disillusionment is will be shown by a reduced feelings of love and partner responsiveness and increased ambivalence about the union over those early years of marriage, and reduced happiness and stability. But it's going to take a long time. It has to chip away, chip away, and chip away. And then you come to the conclusion that it's not going to work. So, what did they do to test these three theories? They wanted to say, well, which one is true? Is it that the relationship wasn't very good to begin with? Or was it that distress emerges in the relationship, that they were a good relationship before they were married, but now they start to lose some of their quality as a relationship? Or is it that they were maybe inadequate or a less than adequate relationship to begin with, but they had such a high level of illusion that they survived? And so what they did was they looked at something called the PAIR project, Processes of Adaptation in Intimate Relationship Project. And it started in 1981. And when the data that they're using involves 4 periods of time in this study: 2 months after the marriage, 1 year later, 2 years later, and 13 years later. Okay. They had 168 couples. They were all from the middle part of Pennsylvania, from the Nittany Mountains, because at the time the principal author and the head of the PAIR project was at Penn State University. Mostly white, working class, rural families. So we have to take that into consideration. Whenever you do a longitudinal study, you always have a problem, right? That you have to get people to agree to participate in this thing for a long time. So usually you've got a smaller population, a more homogeneous population. It's hard to get a large random sample and then be able to follow those people up successfully over time, because you can't lose them along the way. You've got to keep them in the study. And so this is a case in this study. So bear that in mind in terms of the findings. Results. Okay, so they looked at, well, what predicts divorce, but they didn't just ask what predicts divorce overall. They looked at what predicts divorce at different points in time in the marriage. So the first question is, which of these models predicts early marriage, divorce in early marriage? So within a year. So the first 1 year follow-up, how many of them were still married and how many got divorced, and which ones got divorced? And so what they labeled this is precocious divorce, right? Divorce before its scheduled time. And what they found was that the model that predicted precocious divorce was really the enduring dynamics model. That the couples with weak initial romantic bonds at time 1, that was 2 months after their marriage, high ambivalence about their relationship to begin with, they weren't sure they should have gotten married anyway, low affectional expression, at time 1 they didn't show a lot of affection towards each other relative to other couples, high negativity, low responsiveness, and high contrariness. Those were the couples who had a greater likelihood of divorce at time 1, 1 year later, the precocious divorce group. That was consistent with enduring dynamics. In other words, they started off with a crappy relationship, so it ended. Okay? Then they looked, what about divorce after year 1? And there's 2 groups for what happens if you survive the first year. There's 2 groups there. There's a group that survives 2 to 7 years. So they get divorced either in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, or 7th year. So they call this the early divorce couples. And these are where most divorces happen. Most divorces happen, well, the modal year for divorce is year 2. more divorces happen in year 2 than at any other year. Now, I'm not saying most people who are going to get divorced in year 2. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that more divorces happen in year 2 than happen in year 1, or happen in year 3, or happen in year 4, right? Year 1 is pretty high as well. So the divorce, if you did a scale, how long you've been living in your relationship and how long you've been married, it just goes, no divorces from the day you're married. And then 1 year, within 1 year, it goes up. Within year 2, it goes way up. And then it just comes down. It stays high and comes down till year 7 or so, 7 to 10. And so 2 to 7 years is when most people get divorced. If you added up all the divorces, the percentage of divorces in each year, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, more than half of all the divorces are going to happen. If you make it past year 7, you're in pretty good shape. If you can get past year 10, you're in really good shape. At least in the past several decades, that's been the pattern. When you get married, it may change. Okay? So what about the people in that peak years of divorce? What predicts that? And there, it's the emergent distress model. These couples had reasonably good relationships to start with, but when they studied the nature of their relationship each year afterwards, they found that gradually the qualities of their relationship started to deteriorate. They don't know exactly why. It could just be the natural progression of their relationship, that they couldn't manage living together successfully, or it could be that there were things that happened in their lives that undermined different qualities of their marriage. And so what happens here is they found that during the period between their marriage and when they get divorced, these couples showed increased ambivalence over the years about their relationship, became less and less sure that they did the right thing, if you want to put it that way. Decreased romantic bonds and decreased perceived responsiveness from their partners. So they saw that their relationships deteriorated. And it's not just the couple saw this. The researchers saw that there was decreasing responsiveness. And so these couples were showing signs of stress that weren't present to start with. And so the emergent distress model is how we define, or what predicts, early divorced couples. Later divorced couples who get divorced after 7 years of marriage, they weren't in the emergent distress group, they were in the disillusionment group. So these couples had extremely high levels of initial romantic bonds and affection. They were that super lovey-dovey couple that seemed to be perfect in every way. I watch too much television movies. There used to be a show called The Bob Newhart Show. And Bob Newhart was a comedian from years ago, and he ran an inn in Vermont. And they had the perfect couple, was actually a character in the show. It was this man and this woman. They were the perfect couple. And that was their thing. They were going around being the perfect couple. That's what these groups are like. Okay? Decreased affection and responsiveness over time and increased ambivalence happened in these relationships, yes. But unlike the emergent distress couples, who also experienced decreased affection, responsiveness, and increased ambivalence, these couples survived past 7 years. The thing that led them to survive past 7 years was that extremely high level of illusionment, thinking that their relationship was perfect, and kind of playing that out. And so they became so dissatisfied afterwards, their expectations were so high that as things dwindled, those expectations allowed them to survive those first 7 years. They weren't aware of what their situation was. These couples, the emergent distress couples, they were aware that their relationship was deteriorating, that it wasn't working out. And so they got divorced when they started to realize that, 2 to 7 years. This group of couples, because they had such high illusionment, their relationships were declining, or they may have been low to begin with, and are still declining even further. The difference is that they didn't realize it. It took 7 years for them to, in the colloquial, to wake up and smell the coffee, that the relationship wasn't working. And so disillusionment becomes a key factor in the transition to marriage and something that determines the likelihood of experiencing a successful transition. It's kind of important research in a way, because what happens between year 2 and 7 in a typical life course of a family in the United States? Children. Huh? And so what happens here, this kind of effect is particularly damaging. You know, the first group, they're probably not a problem. They probably didn't have any children anyway. So you know, who gets hurt? Probably it was a good decision for them to get divorced anyway, before they had children. And they go find somebody else. This group, sometimes children are in this group, and sometimes children may be a reason for this declining relationship, but maybe less children than here. After 7 years, a lot of couples have had children. And the illusionment has led them to last that long. So now they have children, they get divorced, and now you've got a much more complicated outcome with potentially more damaging outcomes, not just for the couple involved, but now for their children as well. So conclusions, all three models operate at different times. Enduring dynamics predicts precocious divorce, emergent distress predicts early divorce, and disillusionment creates later divorce. Transition to parenthood is another important transition that there's been a lot of research associated with from the developmental perspective. And so let's look first at what are some of the developmental tasks associated with this transition. And the very first one that we'll look at have to do with family and individual identities. And so when couples have children for the first time, it usually involves a revising of their family themes. They have to kind of think about who are they now as opposed to just being a couple, somewhat free agents, somewhat detached from their families of origin, independent from them, still have relationships with their parents, but really they operate without a strong integration with either family too much. Now with a child, they have to kind of reassess who they are, maybe start thinking about what are their goals in new ways, or at least in more concrete ways. They may have always thought that they might have children, or that they wanted to have children, and that was part of the meaning that they made about their marriage. But they never really incorporated the idea of being parents to a very specific degree, most couples, until the child arrives. And so now they have to think of themselves as a different kind of family in a very real way as opposed to an idealized way. And so how are children viewed and valued is one of the key elements of this, of how they're going to define their identity. Are they going to be a couple who have a child? Or are they going to be a child-centered family in which the couple relationship goes into the background and the focus becomes on the children, and everything is going to revolve around the children? You could have, and then there are several identities or themes that you could have in between, right? So I don't know, can you assess what your family was like growing up? Do you think your family was more of, we're a couple that have children, or from a very early on, your family was one in which when that first child was born, it was all about children?
Mm-hmm. All about children.
Probably a lot of families in our society today are like that. Probably my family that I have today, not so. Still probably a couple with a child. Child was brought along, wasn't diminished in importance, but the focus of family life wasn't around the child. It was probably somewhere in between. It wasn't like the child was an appendage, but you know, it was a more integrative kind of a concept of of family life. So how is child viewed and valued in that family? And that's going to play a big part in how roles are rearranged, how boundaries are set, et cetera, how resources are expended. They're going to be expended in ways that are consistent with whatever that identity or theme is with respect to the child. One important distinction that gets made in a lot of families is whether or not that child is seen as an unwanted burden versus as a potential source of rewards. And so you can imagine some families, that child is thought to be something of a burden. It may not be the first child, although even there it could be, especially in the case of unplanned pregnancies, in which the child results in some major shifting of resources in the family or some major shifting in the dynamics of the marital couple because, let's say, it involves someone dropping out of the workforce in order to take care of the child because there's not resources to accommodate that child in other ways. So is this a burden or is this a blessing? Is it something that you see there's going to be lots of rewards? Now, fortunately, most couples that have children see the child as a source of rewards. At least one member of the couple feels that way. Of course, it's important that they both feel that way. Otherwise, that diminishes the nature of family life. And then another aspect of how the child is viewed has to do whether it's a personal couple or family significance. Do you have a child as a completion of who you are as a person? And so there are many women out there who want to have a child to be a mother. And that's the significance of it, the primary significance of it. To be a mother is so important. That's what they want. And that's the motivation, and that's how they see the child. They see the child as an extension of themselves. Or is that child integrated in a sense of its significance for the couple? This is a project that we share together, that we're both important in this project that we have now. And that the child is an extension of both of us, not just one of us. Or can we even think of it in an even broader sense, family significance? Is this child an outgrowth of our families going forward intergenerationally? Is this child someone who's bringing together a larger group? Yeah, we got married and we kind of became separated, but now the child's here. That means that we become a much fuller group, incorporating other kinds of relationships. Part of this we can distinguish between the idea of family legacy and maybe a family compensatory framework. Some couples see the child as having family significance, which would be a family legacy kind of approach. Others kind of see it as more of a compensatory framework, that the child is a way of compensating for something that's lacking otherwise in family ties, either connection with family of orientation and family growing up, that this child is sort of something that I didn't have a very good life growing up and this child is now going to be the compensation for that. Or it could be in terms of the couple, that we're not getting along very well. The child is now what's going to hold us together and is going to compensate for the lack of what we don't have in our marital relationship. Okay, so obviously, family legacy is a much stronger kind of theme during this transition than would be a family compensatory framework for thinking about how this child fits in the family. Is the child part of who we are as a couple or as a family? Or is this child compensation for the lack of family or the lack of coupleness, in which case it becomes more of a personal connection and not creating a family concept, more of just something that is belonging to or significant for the individual, not their marriage or their family life. Constructing parental and child identities is also important with regard to building family and individual identities, and this involves congruity of meanings of motherhood and fatherhood to begin with. So we all kind of have a sense of what we feel a father should be or what we feel a mother should be. When we get married, we may or may not talk about that. I think most couples don't. They might talk about whether they would like to have a child someday in the future, but they don't really discuss what that means in terms of their identities, what they would then take on as expectations for themselves as a mother, or what it means in terms of what I would do, what I would expect myself to do, and how I would expect myself to behave if I was a father. We don't really negotiate those things. We don't talk about them very much until the child is born, and we start operating on the basis of those expectations that we have for ourselves. Not only for ourselves, but for the other person. So when we have that child, all of a sudden I start expecting that you're going to be a certain kind of mother, and my wife expects that I'm going to be a certain kind of father, and we're going to be expecting each other to behave in particular ways that we didn't necessarily talk about beforehand. And so that's a particular issue that we're going to have to sort out. What is the identity of being a mother and a father? What's important to us? Because we're going to have to negotiate later on. One of the tasks that we'll talk about also having to do with this is how do we negotiate our roles? And we can't negotiate those roles successfully unless we understand what the meaning of those identities are that are attached to those, that those roles are attached to. So what does it mean for the wife to be a mother, and what does it mean for the husband to be a father? What's important to them? What have they internalized over time, growing up in their lives, as being the significant thing about being a father or a mother? Parents' identity salience hierarchies also shift at this time. And so when we're constructing who are we as a person within the context of our relationship, we now have to think about what is the importance of being a mother or a father relative to the importance of being a husband or a wife, relative to the importance of being a good worker or someone who has a career, right? Or being a good son or daughter. And so individuals walk around with multiple identities. They're all integrated into the self. You're a student. That's an identity that you have. You're a daughter. You're a girlfriend of somebody. You're a child. You're a daughter of somebody, of parents, right? You're a worker. You have different identities. You integrate them together. You try to negotiate. Every identity has a set of role expectations attached to it. What do you expect of yourself as a student? What do you expect of yourself as a worker? What do you expect of yourself as a daughter? And then you kind of have to negotiate between those different identities in your day-to-day life. You have to decide, well, where am I going to invest my energies? Where am I going to invest my resources? What happens if being a student runs contrary to being a worker? Which one am I going to give priority to? And so that idea of how we rank identities in importance, we call it an identity salience hierarchy. Which identities are more salient than others in that hierarchy? So when you get married, if you don't have a child yet, you have an identity, a sort of a sort of under the surface identity of what it means to be a mother or a father, but it's not really very high in the hierarchy because there's no child yet. Okay? So usually we'll put being a wife or a husband pretty high up in those early stages of marriage. We'll oftentimes put being a worker below being a husband or a wife in those early years of marriage. And so our identity hierarchy usually looks like husband, wife, worker, child of our parents, and sort of submerged under all that is this yet emergent identity of being a parent. When the child's born, now all of a sudden we shift things around. And with some people, there's a radical shift. With some people, being a parent all of a sudden takes extreme priority in that salience hierarchy. It goes to the top. So being a parent overrides being a spouse or overrides being a worker. And that can be an issue in a relationship, right? Because the other person might not see it that way. The other person might not see being a father as being the critical identity that they have. They see being a husband as a critical identity, whereas the mother sees being a mother as more critical. And that husband might want the wife to be more of a wife than being more of a mother. And so that can cause conflicts in the relationship. And so one thing that has to be dealt with is this: what is the relative importance of different identities that we possess? Because those identities are going to have implications for our behaviors. How much physical, emotional, psychological, and social involvement do we place in the roles attached to those identities? So if you put much greater emphasis on being a mother relative to being a wife, then you're going to put more of your physical, emotional, psychological, and social energies and involvements into being a mother, which means that there's going to be less left over for being a wife, right? There's going to be less left over for being a good worker or a career woman. And so those other identities, because they're lower in the hierarchy, the role performance within each of those is going to go down. And as a result, the people that you are in a role relationship with respect to those identities, are going to be impacted. So if you reduce how much you put into being a wife, then what's your husband going to think about that? How are they going to handle that? Are they going to understand it? And so that's an issue of identity salience hierarchies. And then consensus on the child's identity. When you see that child, what do you see? What do you see as a future for that child? What are the outcomes that you're anticipating for that child? Is it going to be important that the child behave? Or is it going to be more important that the child have creativity? What kind of child are you going to have? Are you going to have a child who you're going to put all the emphasis on having this maximum level of emotional and psychological adjustment, or are you going to put emphasis on this child being successful? What are the values you're going to place on this child in terms of the outcomes that you have for it? That all goes into the perception of what is the identity of that child. And so couples in this stage have to have some level of consensus about the child's identity. Otherwise, it can result in conflict, intergenerational coalitions, one parent teaming up with the child to make it what they want it to be in opposition and keeping the other parent away from the child, preventing it from shaping that child in a different way, and clarity of expectations for the child. Because both parents are going to put expectations on the child, and so the child could find itself in a conflict between parents as a result. I always like to use this, I've talked about my family a lot. In my family, child identity was mostly determined by my father before I was born. For some reason, when I was born, it shifted over and my mother got to have her choice of child identity. But at least there was a consensus. My father endorsed my mother's goals for what she wanted me and my sisters to be like who followed me. He conceded to that. So there was consensus. And so she influenced the direction that we went, as opposed to my father having really the bigger impact on my older siblings, at least my older brothers. Another set of tasks has to do with setting internal and external boundaries. External boundaries really come into question during the transition to parenthood because you're going to come into contact with a whole network of family, friends, and healthcare providers. There's going to be a lot of people who are now going to take an interest in what's happening in your family life. People who had no interest at all, or very limited interest before. And so there's a two-edged sword to this interest. One is you're going to need these people. These people are going to be important resources to help you better make an adjustment to the transition. They're going to provide you with non-tangible resources, maybe some food and supplies or some housing accommodations. They're going to provide you with monetary resources to help you out, to buy clothing and furniture that you're going to need to care for the child. They're going to help you out with lots of emotional supports and advice. So you're going to need them in order to know how to handle this child. Basically, every parent goes into being a parent tabula rasa. They really, I mean, yeah, they had baby dolls growing up and they read stories and they read journal articles and magazine articles about being a parent for the first time, and people told them what to expect. But when that child arrives, there is no clue until you actually experience it. Right? Not to scare you away, it's really exciting, but it's, you know, they write books about this, you know, baby taming manuals.
No, it was funny when I was born, my mom was like, I'm ready to have this baby, I'm ready. As soon as I was born, my dad took care of me for the first 9 months of my life. My mom was like, I want nothing to do with this child.
It's like, what do you do, right? Yeah. I know. You need someone to show you where as my foster son said when my daughter was born, where's the off switch?
Yeah.
You need someone to show you where the off switch is. So families have to go, marriages, the family that started in marriage now transforms itself, and it has to shift its boundaries from what was usually a pretty semi-closed system, keeping other people out, focusing inward on your partner, to being more of a semi-open system where you're opening up those boundaries to let more people in. And so you move from this semi-closed to semi-open boundary system. And this has implications for guidance, support, and for avoiding enmeshment as well. I mean, you don't want to be so enmeshed that when this child is born that you keep everybody out and you make it so focused on what's happening inside that you wind up not sort of stepping on each other to a much greater degree. And that then child comes up in a family in which they become enmeshed and they never really differentiate themselves from family life. So opening up those boundaries is healthy. It's a good thing to do. However, you have to be careful not to do it too much, because there's a greater potential problem of over-involvement of kin, and this stems from something called grandparents' intergenerational investment, that when you have a child, your parents have an investment in you having that child, in that child. They have a lot to gain from it. Okay. On two levels. One, the idea that they're older now and they're starting to think about, you know, when I die, what's going to be coming along after me that carries on what I was. And so they are thinking, all right, yeah, I have a daughter or a son, and they're going to continue the legacy that I started with them. But, you know, they're going to be older too, and so that child represents a greater extension of that historical legacy. And so parents make meaning out of their life. They make meaning out of their life by having children and bringing them up and watching them grow and develop. And then as they're launched, then they kind of lose some of that contact. It becomes less about them and more about their children's own independent lives. And then when this grandchild comes along, now they're even older and they're trying to continue that connection and establish that biography that's so critical to their well-being. And so they're interested in intergenerational continuity, and a lot of grandparents are at a stage of their life where they've retired. And so that retirement means that they've reduced their roles in life. They don't have work roles so much anymore, right? There's less dynamic in their day-to-day family life with their spouse. They're not very involved kinds of roles. Less social participation. And so what they're doing is they see the grandparenting role as one that can be really a source of lots of rewards. And so they really want to be part of it. Now, most grandparents don't want to be so much a part of it that all they are is babysitters for children, or that they wind up having to take care of their grandchildren. They like having their children over, they like spoiling them, etc. because they're looking for the rewards from the role. And it's kind of voluntary on their part. They don't have the responsibility that the parent has, most grandparents. And they don't want that responsibility as much as they just want the rewards. And so they're going to be trying to be involved in that way. And so this creates a potential for conflict and emotional drain of conflict management. How do you manage those grandparents? How do you let them in but keep them out at the same time? How do you let them in without undermining what you're trying to do as a parent? Because there'll be intergenerational differences, right? What they think is a good parent is different than what a good parent is today. It was a good parent 30, 40 years ago. It's not a good parent today, necessarily. And so there's going to be a clash, a cultural clash to some degree, in these relationships that the couple has to manage. Another is the intrusiveness of providers. Sometimes the providers can be intrusive. They can interfere with your family life. Actually, let me go back. I put this one in here because one research project that I attempted several years ago, well, 10 years ago, was a proposal to kind of look at how infant feeding practices impacted marital relationships. Like, should a couple breastfeed their child or bottle feed their child? And it didn't get funded because I made an argument that maybe bottle feeding, maybe breastfeeding wasn't the best option for a child if we considered how it might have impacted the dynamics between the couple. That breastfeeding does a couple of things. One, it increases the investment of the mother in the mothering role, which could have the potential for detracting the father's involvement, which in the long run might be very beneficial for the child if the father was involved, but now because of the feeding demands and the increased role identity salience for women, might push the father into the background, and he might not be as involved in his child's life as he otherwise might have been. And if we think that father involvement is really important for children, that might be something that you lose with breastfeeding, and bottle feeding allows fathers to do that. So I made these different arguments, and another one had to do with the intrusive, So I made this argument, and it didn't get funded because it went to a health sciences panel, and I kind of didn't think it would get funded because it was full of nutritionists and nurses, and nutritionists and nurses have, there's only one thing. You don't ever raise any question to the idea of breastfeeding. And I understand where they're coming from. For families, for children who grow up in non-sanitary, poor environments, breastfeeding has clear advantages in terms of health outcomes. For children who grow up in middle-class, white middle-class Western societies with great sanitation and nutrition, not so much of a difference.
Yeah, especially if the mothers are working, they only get 3 months maternity leave, so they have to either pump every morning or go to the bottle anyways.
Mm-hmm. And most modern women don't breastfeed for much more than 6 months, and the World Health Organization says that the health effects only happen if you do it for at least 2 years. But that's based upon studies of children in poverty and studies of children in Africa and disadvantaged countries where there are real threats to health that the benefits of breast milk really overcome. In any case, I knew it was going to get funded. But then it started me thinking, well, and this was in Canada at the time, how do hospitals treat new mothers? And because we were going to do the research in a Canadian hospital, we had to learn about the process of giving birth in the Canadian system. And it came to our realization that in Canada, when you give birth to a child, you cannot feed that child with a bottle at all in the hospital. It's prohibited. You cannot they do not allow any formula company to give you any kind of gifts of formula or bottles or anything. They never teach you anything about feeding a child with a bottle. And in the Canadian system, they have a great healthcare system, especially in prenatal, natal care, and they often have visits into the home. And so you get what amounts to a very opinionated medical person intervening in your relationship. And I thought back to myself when I had my child, and I thought, gosh, I would have hated this. This would have caused so much consternation in my relationship from both me and my wife, to have someone beating us over the head and telling us we were wrong, because my wife didn't breastfeed our daughter. My daughter was bottle fed, and I was heavily involved in parenting, and I saw that as being really important. And how do you manage that? How would I manage that? That's a threat to the integrity of my family system, to have a service provider intervene in how I and my wife ran our family life. And so in some ways, you have to be able to have boundaries to prevent these kinds of intrusions. On the other hand, you can't ignore them because they're very important. You know, my wife and I went to prenatal classes, and we learned about these various things about taking care of a child and the impacts on the relationship afterwards, and that was important. But we had to make sure that the providers knew their place relative to our family boundaries. Work-family boundaries also have to be negotiated. There's a great potential for role conflict, overload, and role strain as a result of having a child. And this is a particularly greater problem for the wife or mother, that she has so many demands, usually with taking care of a child, if she's the primary provider. And if she has a career, then she's going to have to juggle those two possibilities. And if her husband doesn't participate to a large degree, then what happens is she gets overburdened with the demands of being both a wife and a worker and a mother at the same time. And so this is the idea of role conflict, role overload, and role strain in terms of the work-family boundaries. Role conflict refers to situations where the expectations attached to one role come into conflict with the expectations of another. So how can I be a good worker and be a good mother at the same time when taking care of my child demands that I be home on certain days and not able to fulfill my responsibilities at work? And so that's role conflict. Role overload is I may not be in conflict with the two roles might not be in conflict with each other, but in trying to do both sets of roles, or more than two sets, but family versus work, in trying to do all my family and my work role responsibilities, I'm just exhausted. I'm just wasted away. I just can't keep up with the demands. It's not that one prevents me from doing the other. It's not that because I have to be home, I can't be at work at the same time. I'm going to do the work and the family. I'm going to do both of them, but it's pretty much draining all of my energies in doing so because there's so much demand. And then role strain is a sense that you can't adequately fulfill the capacities, you can't adequately fulfill the expectations attached to one or the other role, the work or family roles. So there has to be some boundaries set between work and family. You have to be able to say, here's the boundary of where work can go, how much work can ask of me, and here's the boundary of how much family life can ask of me. Internal boundaries, there's a need to maintain space for spousal companionship, communication, and intimacy. One of the things that really can be threatened in the transition to parenthood is the boundary that preserves the marital subsystem, right? We talked about system models. We talked about how important that boundary is. And there needs to be three kinds of separation: physical, social, and psychological. So when you interact with your partner, there should be a space that you have with your partner that's separate from the space that you have with your child. That would foster a more positive marital relationship if the child's not present during those interactions. Not that all interactions have to be that way. There's going to be a lot of shared interactions with the child. But when you're focusing on your marriage, there needs to be that ability to get the child away so that you can focus on the issues in your marriage and maintain the quality of that relationship. Social separation is in terms of the kinds of connections that you have with other people. And so who are your friends as a couple? Well, before the child is born, it's quite a variety of people. When the child is born, do you drop all of the not children who, all the friends who don't have children and just focus with families that do have children of your child's age? Or do you separate out and say, well, we're going to do a lot with other couples, but then we're also going to do with couples who don't have children? And so that's sort of a social separation of worlds. The world of the child and the world without the child. The world of families and the world of couples. And in some ways that helps facilitate that marital relationship. And then psychological separation. Do you see yourselves as husband and wife different from father and mother, especially when dealing with each other? Now, there's nothing wrong with this idea, but I use it as an example of what I would mean by psychological separation. It's very symbolic in nature, yes, but here's the example. I don't know. You have to tell me whether your family did this. Do your parents refer to each other by their names, or do they call each other mom and dad?
Names.
Names.
No, it's like, go ask your dad.
They
Like,
do.
hey, dad. Like,
Go ask your dad. But when they talk to each other, do they say, does your dad say mom? Yeah?
Yeah, my dad says mom, or my mom says dad. Like, she'll be like,
When
dad.
they're actually talking to them about something else.
Oh,
say
yeah,
dad.
if we're in the room. Yeah.
If you're in the room.
But if they're talking, like, if they're at dinner or something with each other, they'll be like, oh, well, Scott did this today, or Raquel did this, or whatever.
Okay. Yeah. In some ways, that's what I'm thinking in terms of, do you see yourselves as no longer husband and wife and just father and mother with relationship to each other? To some degree, it's not totally wrong, but and to a certain degree, it reflects the theme of your family. Is your family about the child, or does it also preserve the notion of the marriage and being a couple? But that's sort of what this sense of a psychological separation, that you can see each other as a marriage couple as opposed to just being mom and dad. If it's just being mom and dad, then you're going to lose a lot of the dynamics and qualities of the intimacy that would be involved in that marital tie. And so the marital subsystem will be qualitatively less fulfilling in those kinds of relationships. Household management. And so one of the big things with the transition to parenthood is that all of a sudden this child is creating all kinds of havoc with the kinds of role relationships in the family. Who's doing what? Who should do what? How much time are you investing? How much energy are you investing in doing different things that have to be done to maintain family life? And what usually happens, the research shows, that most couples, during the transition to parenthood, they experience something called the traditionalization of sex roles. So before the child is born, there's lots of sharing. There's a pretty low level of sex stereotyping in terms of who does what. Men cook and shop alongside their wives. Women work while their husbands are also working. Women might mow the lawn as much as their husbands do, fix the car. There's a lot of integration and sharing of roles that happen in that early marriage relationship. When a child's born, it all goes away. When a child is born, women tend to get isolated in the home, tend to take care of the child, and they tend to take care of household tasks. Men, on the other hand, tend to invest more in work. They tend to become more focused on their work roles, and this creates a huge separation. So we call it a traditionalization of sex roles, because it's like 100 or 200 years ago, this is what men and women did anyway. Women didn't work. Women stayed home, took care of children in the household. Men worked outside the home, probably 100 years ago. Go back 200 years ago, men were more in the home. But there's a period of time in Western history, over the past 200 years, where women became more focused on a domestic sphere and men in a public sphere. So we call that a traditionalization of sex roles, because the modern marriage, which doesn't have that, in modernity we don't subscribe to those ideas so much anymore, right? Women work, men do housework, men cook. Pretty much expect, when you get married, you expect if you get married to a man, is it expect a husband to work? I mean, to work around the house, to cook and clean? What do you think?
I mean, I see it more in families, but not from like just the way I was raised. Like my grandma does everything for my grandpa, my mom does everything for my dad. Like I haven't seen it growing up any other way.
You haven't seen it any other way?
Yeah, I see it with the people that like the kids that I babysit, like they're shared roles completely, but not for my family.
Yeah.
But that's just.
I'd say we're pretty stereotyped too. The only thing my dad did inside the house was clean the toilets. Other than that, it was.
Yeah, my father never did anything in the house, ever. But I do a lot. And I think my wife, her father never did anything around the house. But I think she expected that I would do a lot, that she anticipated a relationship that wasn't that way. Mm-hmm. She anticipated for her own life a relationship that was more dynamic and had more sharing of roles. And I certainly liked to cook, and I loved involvement in childcare, et cetera. Those are all important elements to my family life. But I didn't get it from just because I was raised that way doesn't mean that I endorse that in my own life today, because my life and my expectations for myself and for my partner are probably more shaped by the changes that have happened in society since then when I was growing up. And so I see images of men involved in childcare, involved in cooking, to some degree involved in taking care of the home, but not so much as the others. And so I think today most couples sort of develop a relationship that involves more sharing of roles, less segregation of roles. When they experience a transition to parenthood, they fall back into those traditional sets of role expectations. And that can be problematic. It can be particularly problematic for the wife, mother, because she's usually the one that loses in this deal. She's going to lose something that's really important in many cases, and that's her work role. And that means she's going to lose her access to resources in independence and autonomy in the relationship. And so she's going to become more dependent if this traditionalization of roles happens. Her life is going to be centered around taking care of the home and the child. So preparation for household and care. The reason for this traditionalization is that women generally are more prepared for household and caregiving roles, because in most families, they're raised in this way. As you said, when you were growing up, the images that you got, the people that showed you what it meant to be a woman or a wife or a husband, they showed you a model, and you learned it. You participated in helping with the cleaning, helping with the cooking, maybe helping with the care of brothers or sisters. You certainly were exposed to dolls and other kinds of activities that girls are exposed to teach them how to be mothers. Your brothers probably didn't get any of that. And so they really aren't as prepared to do those kinds of roles. Now, it's okay when you're just a couple. The husband can bumble around in the kitchen and kind of learn how to cook in the moment, because there's not anything really of pressing need. There's enough time for the wife to kind of get him involved in helping with the cleaning and those types of things. He can learn how to do the laundry. There's lots of opportunities for them to share the roles, because there isn't that demand. When the child's born, the demand hits. And when the demand hits, what do? We fall back on, well, what's the optimization? What's the way to optimize the outcomes? How are we going to handle all these tasks? Well, you really don't know anything about a child. I do. So let me do that. You take care of other things. And so what happens is you get this separation. A lot of it coming from preparation, not just in abilities, in knowing how to do the tasks, but preparation in the sense of thinking that doing that is important, that is part of who you are as a person. And so parental identity is going to shape role content and salience. Is another part of this traditionalization. It's not just who's prepared, it's how important is it for each person relative to their parental identity. So what does it mean to be a mother in our society today versus what it means to be a father? And what's the salience of that identity for men and women? Generally in our society, being a mother is way up there for women. And there's some very interesting articles that have been written that look at how the meaning of womanhood is intimately tied to the meaning of motherhood. The meaning of fatherhood is more tied to the meaning of work. And so what happens is parental identity makes the kinds of roles that are associated with caring for a child and thereby in general generalized to caregiving for the home and the husband, that all gets generalized together and those become central to the wife, and she does those things. And she kind of pushes the husband away. She takes those things over. They're important to her. She was raised with that identity. He kind of falls off, and then he falls into what would have been important for him, and that's being a good earner, providing for his family, etc. And those roles become more critical for him now. And he's not, to some degree, allowed to shift and share that load with the wife and thereby come into being a mother. And so what can happen here is something of a wife ownership of the caregiving role and potential for men's role distancing from household and child caregiving. Also, external pressures contribute to this. Even if you're a man and you want to be a mother, I use these terms. What do you mean? How can a man be a mother? How can a woman be a father? Well, think about that. What does it mean to be a mother or a father? It's not attached to your gender, to your sex. It's attached to the kinds of things that you do, right? Mothers do mothering. What's mothering?
Taking care of the children in the house.
Taking care of children, right? Providing for children, their emotional cares and psychological needs. What's fathering?
Working.
Working? Although it's changing, isn't it? Fathering is not just working, it's actually, today it's evolved. Fathering is more taking care of a child, at least playing with the child, being involved in the child's life, not just being a distant. Used to be fathering was just, really it was just providing sperm. That's what fathering was. Right? After that point, mothers took over, the fathers were sort of on the margins. Fathers never participated in the birth of their children. They were never there. They were shunned into the other room. Right? But today, fathers are there. Fathers are part of the process. They go to the prenatal classes. And so, what if I wanted to be a father beyond just going to prenatal classes? What if I wanted to be a father and I really wanted to be a primary caregiver for my child? What if I wanted to be able to say, my child is sick today. My wife and I both work. I feel the responsibility to go home and take care of that child. I feel 24/7 like this child needs my care and concern. And so while I'm working, I'm thinking about my child. And I'm going to talk about my child all the time to my friends at work. What kind of reaction am I going to get?
It's not the norm.
It's not the norm. Right? I'm going to get pressured. What, are you crazy? You need to provide for your child. That's what fathers should do. Because that's the way our society is structured, by gender, right? So, can a father be a mother? Can a father do mothering? Yes. But is it easy? No. Partly because they often don't have the training. Partly because The mothers are going to want to have that part because it's tied to their identities, and partly because of external pressures. People at work are going to cut them the slack to do the mothering. They might let the mother take time off to go take care of the child, female, but they won't let a male take the time off to go take care of a child. Even in societies where they give parental leave benefits to both the mother and the father equally, the fathers don't take it. Sweden gives you leave, if you're a father, for taking care of your child. But men don't take it because the informal social norms are so strong that they have the legal permission to do it, but they don't have the social permission to do it. And so lots of external pressures from work, parents, friends, other institutions, religion, they're going to play a role and pressure the couple and to some degree, they will make that negotiating more difficult. And as a result, in most couples, even couples that don't want a traditionalized sex role in their families, wind up with it. If the wife is employed, we have something called the level of husband cooperation. So the one place where men are allowed to come in is if the mother also is working. And then the father can be an assistant. And so it's called the law of husband cooperation. It's an exception to the norm, to these social pressures. Yeah, you can take care of your child in an emergency situation, but that child shouldn't be on your mind all the time. You're helping out the mother. So I have colleagues, and I have a colleague who always says, well, he's not going to go to something that we were planning. He'll say, I have to babysit tonight. I have to babysit. Yeah, I have to take care of my kid. No, it's your kid. You don't babysit your own kid. Right? But that idea of being a babysitter for your own child is tied into this idea of the law of husband cooperation. He's allowed to be a man and to be involved in child giving because of this law of husband cooperation. He's helping out his wife. His wife is the one primarily responsible. And we even use it in our language. So he calls himself a babysitter. He's not doing mothering. It's not appropriate for him to do mothering. It is appropriate to him as a husband and father to help out his wife who is doing the mothering. Financial management is another task related to system maintenance, adjusting to reduced income and increased costs. And so families during the transition of parenthood really experience a lot of financial pressures. Children are costly. They're costly from the day they're born, and they continue to just amass cost throughout their lives. I think the last statistics I read is that to bring a child from infancy to 21 years of age or something, there's like over $1 million. That's what you guys cost.
Does that include school too?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
School, car. Well, that was before tuitions went way up.
Extracurriculars.
Extracurriculars.
You might as well just do cell phones in there while you're at it, because those are expensive.
So those are stressors on family life, and they have to be worked out. Otherwise, family life is going to be diminished. Family system functioning is going to be diminished. And then renegotiation of decision-making and power related to financial management. That oftentimes, because women drop out of the workforce or develop reduced roles, they become and are more tied to the dependency roles of taking care of a child. They need the husband's income more. This really puts them at a power disadvantage in their relationship. And this is the first time where oftentimes those power disadvantages really reveal themselves. And they can sustain themselves throughout the rest of that family life. So women really become more vulnerable and dependent, especially if they drop out of their jobs or if they cut back, and so they don't have careers with trajectories that have greater promise for the future in terms of financial rewards. Men really gain a stronghold of power in the family. And so that can influence how decisions are made. And women may come to feel like their preferences aren't being taken into consideration as much, that they wind up giving up more. Because they know what the structural conditions of their relationship are with respect to power. I mean, it's a definitive condition of a relationship, power. Think of what is power. Power is an ability to get what you want in spite of another person's resistance. And how do you get what you want? You can only get what you want if you are able to do one of two things. You're either able to say, if you give me what I want, I'll give you something that you need that I have. Usually money is a pretty powerful thing, because it can get you a lot of things you need. Or, if you don't do what I want, I'm going to go and find another relationship because I have the financial wherewithal to do so, and you'll be stuck here alone with a child with no income. So, de facto, if there's an imbalance in work roles in a family, especially in a modern society where there are no other institutional controls to force people to stay in the relationship, and where other family members aren't allowed to influence what goes on in that relationship, couples work it out for themselves in an exchange basis, de facto, the husband's going to have more power. He has more power, that's going to ultimately result in women. He doesn't even have to use it, right? He doesn't have to push anything. He doesn't have to say, if you don't do this, I'm not going to give you any of my money. He doesn't even have to do that. The wife is very likely to say, I understand where I'm at. And look, you're earning the income. You should have the primary say. I hope you listen to me, but I have no basis for really challenging what you do. Because if you really want it, something different than I want, you're going to win. I'm going to be stuck. And so, why bother? Just do what you want. And so here, how we make decisions during this transition to parenthood and afterwards, men gain power, and they're generally going to have to work on ways to provide opportunities for their wives to have more input into decision making. Otherwise, over the long run, women are going to become increasingly dissatisfied with their relationship and their family lives. Once it starts here, it's going to continue into the future. Every decision is going to be made by the husband. And today, 100 years ago, not a problem. Women never expected to have any kind of power in their relationships. Today, more of a problem, especially if the wife was working before the child was born. Because if she was working before the child was born, she had a lot more power. And her husband gave in to her wishes way more. Had to give in to her wishes way more. Because she had her own resources. And so financial management becomes a big issue during the transition to parenthood. The last task area with regard to the transition to parenthood is managing the emotional climate. And so what is it about the emotional climate that gets qualitatively different during the transition to parenthood than it was before? So when this child comes in, what is that doing in terms of challenging the family in this area? And at the top of the list is maintaining marital quality and satisfaction. As we've already indicated, there's a lot of things that would argue that the marriage would be pretty much under attack, if you will, by the presence of a child for the first time. That this is really going to pull away time and energies of the spouses for each other because they're dedicating more of those time and energies and resources to the child or to their work activities. And so what we know about managing the marital quality and satisfaction in the transition is that if your relationship was really good when you started, it really helps in the transition. And so prior marital quality really helps with marital adjustment during the transition into parenthood, especially in the areas of communication and decision making. And this is part of this idea. When ecological perspective, we talked about the Chronos system, and this perspective really focuses on the idea that something that happens at one point in the life course is going to set you up to either have a better chance at success or failure in subsequent stages in that course. And this is one really good example. You need to really get your marriage in order before having a child. That's basically what the research says. If you've got a pretty good relationship and you're really satisfied with it and you've developed good communication and decision-making patterns in your relationship, if you work all that stuff out, then you're ready to have a child. You're going to do much better in the transition. If, on the other hand, your marriage is not doing so well, you probably not have a child right away. Now, what about that advice that so many people get when they're having troubles in their early marriage? Well, have a child and that will make everything better. Absolutely the opposite, right? It might cause you to stay in your relationship, but it's not going to improve the relationship, okay? Unless the improvement comes somewhere further down the road. It's very unlikely, because once relationships start in a downward trend, there's a lot of forces that tend to continue to push them in that direction. And so it's best to wait until you have your relationship in order before having a child. And that advice is the worst advice anybody could ever give anybody. To have a child to fix their marriage. No, you fix your marriage to have a child. It works the other way around. The child, if you have one in a poor marriage, you're probably going to stay with your partner for longer. You're less likely to get a divorce, yes. But it's not going to fix your marriage. And so what's that going to mean for the child that has to live in that home? Probably not good, right? And we actually know that the research on divorce shows that divorce has much less of an impact than high levels of conflict in the home. Living in an intact family with lots of marital conflict is the worst thing you can do to a child. It's much better if that couple were to either fix their problem or get divorced. And many children who come from those types of high conflict homes, when their parents get divorced, they say, well, the divorce was hard. I don't like living apart from my parents, but it's way, way better than it was before. And so that's part of what this advice goes into. You know, if you give someone that advice, you're really not only telling them something that's wrong, but you're really setting them up for, and their children, for really not a very good outcome in terms of their family lives. Another important thing that should be done to help manage the emotional climate is to develop accurate or realistic pre-birth expectations. We know that the drop in marital satisfaction that happens after the child is born is due primarily to the development of husband-wife discrepancies. Due first to the development of husband-wife discrepancies in expectations. That the husband and wife are going to have disagreements because they haven't really thought out what their roles are going to be vis-a-vis each other and how important certain elements of roles are going to be for each other. So how important is it that you be there all the time for the child, or how important is it that you be the one that does the feeding of the child, etc. And so those things should be worked out ahead of time. A second element of this pre-birth expectation is even more critical, and that's preventing the development of expectation behavior discrepancies. You want to, after the child is born, we know that couples whose pre-birth expectations fit with what actually happens after the child is born in terms of how they arrange their role relationships, etc., and what is the quality of their affective expression towards each other, the ways they have conflict and how much conflict they have. If they anticipated the changes, they don't suffer the decline in satisfaction. The key is having those expectations that are more realistic and avoiding, therefore, expectation behavior discrepancies. And so if you have more congruency in expectations and behaviors, then there's a greater ease of interaction after the child is born. You kind of understand each other. You don't have to fight about it at that time because you knew it was going to change. Preparation for meeting role expectations. You can prepare yourself for what you're going to have to do after the child is born, because your expectations for what kinds of demands that child's going to make on you are much greater, and so that you can get ready for that and you can set yourself up to do the job better, and establishing a realistic comparison level for rewards. Okay? So in exchange theory, we know that people are profit maximizers. We ought to have lots of rewards and minimize our costs in our relationships. But we understand that sometimes we can't maximize. So we develop these comparison levels to assess, are our rewards satisfactory? Obviously, when a child is born, the level of rewards you're gaining from the marriage directly are going to go down. because of the demands of the child. And so what happens is if you anticipate that and you say, well, I don't expect to get what I got before because the situation has changed, then you're going to be in much better shape and more satisfied with your relationship. Also, with regard to managing the emotional climate is adjusting to changes in sexual relationships. So sexual relationships change after a child is born for a variety of reasons. Some have to do with physical barriers and some have to do with identity changes. Physical barriers, oftentimes after birth of a child, women is interested in having sex for a while. Sometimes it can be painful. And also women, after they have a child, there's this shift, as we said earlier, for a lot of women who place motherhood high in their identity salience hierarchy. So they're devoting all their times and energies to the parenting, and that draws away from their energies for sexual relationships in their marriage. So sometimes that can reduce the levels of sex in the relationship, and the partner has to understand why. So what is the meaning of reduced or changed sexual script? Okay? Is it a sign that we're less intimate or we're less connected because we don't have sex so much anymore? Or is it just because of other things? And that we still have intimacy and connectedness with each other. It's just the physical elements of it and the ways those physical elements are integrated into our idea of closeness shifts and changes. And so we don't interpret these things as meaning more than they really mean. Managing new and expanded areas of conflict. There are 6 common conflict areas amongst couples during this transition that really they point to as a sign or a reason why they're less satisfied with their relationship. They range from extended family relations, which is one of the big ones, because now remember, grandparents are coming in and they're getting involved. And if there were any tensions, for example, prior to the birth of a child between a mother and or one of the spouses and their spouse's family members or even their own, those conflicts are going to be exacerbated because those grandparents are going to want to insist on being involved. And establishing boundaries to keep them out is going to be much more difficult. And so extended family relations is a common area of conflict. Levels of intimacy and support, household and work role allocations, power and dependency issues, individuality versus connectedness, and child socialization goals and practices. And so obviously, you can see all of the previous task areas, when they're not met, they show up in areas of conflict after the child is born, and the couple has to be able to manage these conflicts successfully in order to make a successful transition. Okay. So to give you an example of one study that looks at the transition to parenthood and look at some of their findings, I've chosen this article by Noster and Edgebin, The Effects of Transition to Parenthood and Subsequent Children on Men's Well-Being and Social Participation. So this is a study that's going to look at how the transition to parenthood impacts men's well-being and their social participation. So how does having a child affect fathers? And they look at 2 groups of fathers. First-time co-resident fathers, so men who are living with their wives and they have a child for the first time. And then there'll be, within that, 2 subgroups. Those who have, this is their first child ever. And another group who've had a child where they weren't resident with that child. So these would be a lot of fathers of children born out of wedlock who never had custody of that child. But they've had a child in the past, okay? Or they've fathered a child in the past. And then the comparison group for the first-time co-resident fathers is the first-time non-resident fathers, and that's the group, as I said earlier, the ones who, most of these are fathers who are single fathers who they have fathered a child, but the child doesn't live with them, and it's their first child. So there are 3 conceptual frameworks that they use to look at whether or not having a child will make a difference in these 2 groups. The first is what they call the transformative perspective. And this focuses on the development of identities and the changes in identity that children bring about in the parents, independent of role obligations. Okay? And so, who am I as a father is basically what happens. We don't think about, as I said last time, we don't think about being a father until it actually happens. And then when it happens, psychologically, in ourself, we start reorganizing and we start taking on expectations for how we should behave, not just as a father, but in all aspects of our life. And so does having a child in and of itself, all of a sudden becoming a father, bring about a transformation of your identity in your self-concept? And that's this transformative perspective. That's what it argues, that it does do that. And so parenthood in this perspective is considered to be a quote-unquote generative experience. Okay? That is, fatherhood causes men to revise their self-concepts and reorganize their self-expectations. So you all of a sudden, having a child, your life takes on a different meaning. It generates a different set of expectations for yourself and thereby generates differences in your behaviors. So we call that generative fathering. Areas of redefinition include things like increased focus on extended family relationships. We now care more about our extended family relationships. It reduces non-family social relationships. So we withdraw from the non-family. So family comes higher in priority now because we have a child. Increased involvement in community and service organizations. You didn't care about those so much before, but they're going to be important for the child, so that generates that grade of interest and involvement. Increased attachment to the labor force. Fathers, when they have a child, they start working more and become more serious about their work, because that's a key component of men's identity in terms of fatherhood, is that they have to be good providers. Very interesting, by the way, a side note, there's some research that actually shows that if a father fathers a son as opposed to a daughter, he actually makes more money afterwards.
With a son?
Without working more. If he works even the same amount, if he has a son, he winds up making more money.
How is that?
Well, no, it could be part of generative experience, that the son gives greater self-meaning to the father because it's the same gender. Other people have argued that it could be testosterone, that he works the same amount, but he works harder because there's two males in the family, and so it raises his competitiveness. Another might be that his bosses give him a raise because they recognize him being a father to a son. A daughter is one thing, but a son, there might be in our culture, there might be a gendered expectation that if it's a son, you need to make sure that you give him the groundworks more than if it's a daughter. Could be any of those things. But it's kind of an interesting finding, but it kind of relates to this idea of attachment to the labor force. And lower levels of well-being. That being a father tends to reduce a sense of well-being for you, in the sense that you now have a lot more things to worry about, a lot more things to be concerned about. And as a result, we get a lowering of overall well-being. There's more stress in your life because you care more about this child. Predictions, therefore, were that fatherhood effects would be regardless of residential status or time. That there won't be any differences between the two groups of fathers. They both gave birth to a child. And because they both gave birth to this child, if it's a generative experience, the identity transformation should kick in, and they should both experience the same kinds of changes. Also, subsequent children will have reduced but enhancing effects. That if you have a second child, it's not going to have as big of an impact, right? You've already gone through it once. And so that transformation has happened. It might reinforce it a little bit because now you have two children, and that might make a stronger impression on you, and that might strengthen your focus on being a father. but it shouldn't have a radically different effect. The second approach is what they call the role occupancy perspective. And this perspective says it's not about identity in the sense of an abstract idea. That it's not in the sense of, I'm sorry, an abstract idea. It's not in terms of how being in a new status causes you to reflect on yourself and what is meaningful for yourself in a different way. What's important is that having a child puts upon you a whole new set of obligations. Okay? Because now other people expect you to be different. And so you transform your identity through behavior rather than through a mental cognitive process. So not because you think you're a father now and you have to do these things. And all those expectations from the past come and cause you to act differently. Now, this is saying, no, it's not about that. It's about how having a child, once that child is born, other people now expect you to act differently. Okay? And that, de facto, changes your identity. And then you incorporate that into your idea of what a father is. And so the behaviors shape the identity in the moment. And so fatherhood status invokes social expectations from others that put pressure on fathers while they occupy the role. And here, role expectations are only determined if the role is actively occupied. As a result, fatherhood should affect only the co-resident fathers. Right? Because if you're a non-resident father, you don't have those day-to-day role expectations and obligations. People don't put so much emphasis on you being the sole provider. Provision may be coming from somewhere else. You don't have to be involved in taking care of the child. That comes somewhere else. You're not there. Fatherhood's effect diminish with the age of the child. So even for the co-resident fathers, once the child is born, there is this shifting in terms of who they are as a father and what they do and how they behave. But as the child gets older, those early demands go away and fathers go back to being men, basically. And usually we think of fathers as being involved in the early years of a child's life and then sort of falling away further and further in terms of their involvement. The third perspective says that there's no effect of having a child on fatherhood. And this says that and this is a selection effect. It says fathers look different from non-fathers because they look different beforehand. That if we find a difference between people who are fathers and those who aren't, or fathers who are co-resident and those who aren't, the difference is only because those men already had those kinds of characteristics. That's why they became fathers. Instead of becoming a father made you into that. And so fathers, men who have children who become parents are more likely to be family-oriented, care about their families, more community and service-oriented, and more responsible and involved in work. So it's not that the child makes them that way, it's that they were already there. That's why they had a child. The men who didn't have these characteristics, who weren't family-oriented, they're less motivated to have a child. The ones who are less community and service-oriented, less motivated to have a child. More responsible, involved in work, these are men who probably are thinking more in terms of their identity shaped on work rather than family, so less likely to have a child. So it might be that if we find differences between fathers and non-fathers, has nothing to do with becoming a father, and it might have simply to do with what are the kind of men that become fathers. And so that's the selection effect. So the prediction here is that there's no effect after controlling for selection factors. So if we control for the characteristics of the fathers before the child is born, we won't find any differences between the non-resident and co-resident fathers. This study looked at the National Survey of Families and Households in two waves. So this is the same group of families, the same men. In 1987 through 1988, they studied them the first time. And then they went back in 1992 to 94 and asked them a whole set of questions again. Some of the same questions and a lot of new ones. 3,000 men throughout the United States. This is a very heavily used data set for the study of families. The beauty of it is it's longitudinal. So we can look at what were these men like before they became fathers. And we can control on that to make sure that we can rule out the selection effect. Key findings, there's an additive effect. There are additive effects of, that support both the transformative and the role occupancy explanation. What are those effects? For the new resident child effects, new non-resident child effects, these fathers experienced increased depression, increased social contact, increased contact with non-residential family members and kin, and increased family support received and given. So the new non-resident child, for non-resident fathers, the new child tends to do the things that we anticipated. That there would be a transformation in those men. Okay? There would be a transformation in them simply because they had a child, even if they weren't living with them. Okay? However, for the new co-resident child, for the co-resident fathers, when they had a new child, they experienced reduced social contact, increased involvement in service organizations, reduced contact with non-residential family and kin, an increase in family support received, and increased work involvement. So not only were non-resident fathers affected, but in addition, being co-resident above that also had additional effects. So both the non-resident and the co-resident fathers had a certain level of impacts on their change. So it was transformative to some extent, but the co-residents had additional changes. And so that's the additive nature of the results. So that would support both that there is a transformation that happens, but the transformation is intensified and even greater if it's a co-resident situation, which means that being a role occupant factors into that. Having those outside expectations as well further enhances that development of that identity. There's also interaction effects that support both explanations. Previous fathers, and this would be whether they're co-resident or non-residential, if they had been fathered before, do not experience the increase in support given and received from extended family found for new fathers or non-residential children. So transformation at first child occurs regardless of residential status. So previous fathers, whether they're co-residential or non-residential, do not experience the same kind of changes that we found for new fathers and non-residential children. So in this instance, if you had a father before, if you fathered a child previously, when the second child comes along, it doesn't seem to change you the way that it was changing those fathers who were having their first child. Okay? And previous co-residential fathers do not experience an increase in contact with non-residential family and kin, although previous non-residential fathers do. This indicates that increased contact comes about because of increased role demands associated with being a co-resident for the first time. So let's go backwards and make sense of that. Previous co-residential fathers, so currently co-residential fathers who had had a child previously, do not experience an increase in contact with non-residential family and kin, which is one of our indicators of transformation into fatherhood, although previous non-residential fathers do. So if you were a non-residential father already, becoming a co-resident father transforms you. So that means that increased contact that comes about because of that comes about because of increased role demands associated with being a co-resident for the first time. So I'm a co-resident father for the first time, and so that's why I get the role demands. I was a father already, but it was a non-residential situation, and so I didn't transform my identity to the same degree. I didn't change my behaviors and become a father until after I became a co-resident father. And so it's not just the transformation, it's also the role occupancy that makes a difference. And then time effects support the transformative explanation. Age of youngest child had no diminishing effect on relationship between fatherhood and changes in men's lives. So the age of the youngest child, so that's the last child that this father had no diminishing effect on relationship between fatherhood and changes in men's lives. So if it was a role occupancy explanation, the effect would likely diminish due to reduced role demands and normative pressures. The second child shouldn't have as strong of an effect, but it doesn't. The second child still has a strong effect. And so, according to these authors, if it was a role occupancy explanation, then that second child should have had a reduced impact on that father in terms of changes in his expectations for his role relationships with kin and community and himself in his marriage, and it didn't. It still had a strong effect. So becoming a father a second time still is transformative in nature. Conclusions: all three explanations operate. Fatherhood transforms men's lives, whether they are active co-residential parents or not, and the effect is long-lasting. The effects of fatherhood are stronger if the child is co-resident with the father. And so having a child transforms the man and his image of himself, and it changes his behaviors. And if he's co-resident with the child, then he also experiences expectations from others, which then even further push his involvement in the fatherhood role. And so he becomes even more distinctly and intensely a father in his identity. And there are some effects of fatherhood on well-being are explained by selection. So the fact that these fathers had less well-being isn't really an issue so much of becoming a father as much as it is something to do with something that was present before the child was born. Okay. So there are other aspects of the family development perspective. It obviously looks at all stages of family life. And so we've just looked at the transition to marriage and the transition to parenthood. We can also think of it as looking at the transition into grade school. In particular, there's a lot of research on the transition into adolescence. There's a lot of research on the launching period. And so there's some very interesting research looking at how the process of launching occurs in families, and something called the new phenomenon in our society called boomerang children, who get launched and then they come back, right? And what that does in terms of family life. So can you imagine you're a parent and you get rid of your children and you shift and change your perspective and your themes of your family life, and then all of a sudden they're back, right? How do you manage that? And it's going to be difficult because from a family development perspective, they're gone. And you've transformed those relationships in a way that now, if they come back, just think of things like power and authority, autonomy and connectedness, how all those things are going to shift, right? Think about the ways in which you weren't anticipating someone coming back, and so you invested all your energies in other things, and now they're back, and how that might be disruptive of the family system, especially the marital system. So there's a lot of issues around the launching stage and how that operates. There's also a lot of research around retirement and how retirement impacts the dynamics of family life. So this is the family development perspective. It looks at these transition points, and because those are the points of change, and so it fits very well with the family systems dynamic, right? because family systems theory is all about how families change and adapt, and the family stress perspective. So every one of these points is like a stressor event, except usually it's a normative stressor event and has advantages as a result of that. People adjust to them generally. But they transform families. Families have to reorganize, just as family stress would say, in order to deal with those stressor events and adapt. And there's only a limited number of possibilities for that reorganization. And so families who are in different stages of their life course will look very similar to each other, and certainly will have similar kinds of differences from families in other stages of their life course.